Okay. So this one, go away. Slideshow. Perfect. So we talked already a little bit about the ledger and about how the money are represented in the banking system through the kind of transaction of who owns what and where the money are being transferred. But what are money? Where they came from? Like how the invention of money happened. So we have to go back like a really, really long time ago, to more than 10,000 before Christ. And then we see that the societies were already optimizing, kind of converging to some form of a ledger. And it has been kind of done on a promise basis. So you basically had something that you wanted to sell, and then you gave it to somebody else, and you kind of put a note that, okay, that somebody else owns you kind of a promise, or like owns you something. So when that somebody who got from you, I don't know, a sheep, now has potatoes, they kind of give you back potatoes, right? So it was sort of like we were not using money in the form of actual kind of a representative currency. We were using it in a form of promises. So like you gave something to someone, and that someone promised you to pay you back in something later, right? So we were keeping track of promises. And we had this concept of the ledger. So we always had this sort of kind of a notebook where we kept track of all those promises. And then we sort of started doing exchange with the commodity money, which is like a barter. We call it barter exchange. So barter was basically you were exchanging a particular item for another particular item. So I have a sheep, you have potatoes, I give you my sheep, you give me potatoes, right? And salt, cattle, tobacco, cotton, they were kind of a common currency because they were easily exchangeable for something else. So it was easier for me to exchange my sheep for salt and then my salt for potatoes than to go from my sheep to potatoes directly, right? Because most people need salt. So it was kind of easier to use this sort of a common barter currency at the time. So we go back really long time until this kind of a commodity money, like 9,000, 11,000 years ago. And then we thought, okay, that was a good idea. That worked quite well. But then we should have a little bit easier means of exchange by using something like a representation of the something that we are using. So it kind of it happened like 7,000 years ago that we invented this abstraction that the money in a form of shells or rocks or some sort of representational thing is useful instead of the barter. And this is kind of somewhat surprising that that was already known kind of like really long time ago. And some of the representational money are very interesting. So we're gonna talk about rhinestones in a moment. And then we sort of moved on with the abstractions, and we started using kind of bronze, silver metals, which were kind of harder to mine or harder to produce, and they were more universal. So like rhinestones only work in a particular part of the world. They don't really work as a means of exchange anywhere else. And same with shells or rocks, like it depends where you are. They might be easy to get or they might be harder to get. And it was sort of not that universal. Those became a bit more universal. And then 1,500 years ago, before Christ, I mean, we started using gold. We kind of settled that the gold is a very universal means of exchange. It's kind of an abstract, and it has certain properties that are really good for using it as a means of exchange. So we settled kind of for gold being a gold standard quite a long time ago, yeah, 3,500 years ago. So initially we had this gift economy. So we really started a society using this assumption of connectedness and kind of a reciprocity, right? So we like, if I do something for you, reciprocity. It's a hard word. So you know what I mean, right? Like I do something to you and then you reciprocate and you do that for me. So it was sort of a really a working kind of a social contract system where we are kind of like, if I have, I'm a farmer and now I have more of something, I have more corn, then I can sort of spread it around, and then that, you know, my neighbors will help me when they have more of something, right? And this kind of functioned until modern times. So one of the very young societies is New Zealand. New Zealand is about 160 years old in terms of actual society. And the early settlers there, they came probably around 600 to 700 years ago. And until today, until modern times, in New Zealand, there is this concept of koha. And koha is like you basically don't sell somebody to something, you give it to them in the expectation that they give you back a little bit more than you gave them. So for example, if I help you and I like fix your car, then if I need help, the person for whom I helped, they will help me, and they help even a little bit more than I help them. So there is this like concept of you know, returning a favor and kind of doing something without actually using representational money. So those gift economies were very early on ways of organizing us. And obviously that has a very nice kind of a social cohesion, you know, assumptions. The problem is it doesn't scale. It kind of scales to around, you know, 200, 300 people, which are kind of around you. But then once you're living like in Oslo, you're not going to keep track of like who you helped and who you didn't and so on. Like it's not going to scale, right? So it's like, it works well in kind of a smaller societies, but it doesn't scale to kind of a bigger ones. And it does not transfer from one city, let's say, or one society to the next. Like your ties and your kind of links within your community don't gonna scale to a global system. New Zealand is kind of isolated. Like it has two islands, and they have very far away from anybody else. So they're kind of a closed societies, right? So they could kind of do this because you have this sort of a very close and very small set of people which you sort of which are around you. And then there is not much movement. There are a lot of newcomers and not a lot of people leave. So it's a little bit characteristic to this sort of a gift economy. So then we sort of, like as I showed you on the chart, we started going from those gift economies through barter, like exchange, to representational money. And representational money has nothing to do with anything. They are just an agreement that they represent something, right? So a shell represents like certain value in certain agreements, but shell in itself doesn't have kind of intrinsic value. Like it's not actually valuable in its own, right? And the one interesting one is the rice stones, which were used in the Polynesian islands. And it is a giant you know, a giant rock with the hole in the middle, which was used as a money. It was really hard to have those giant rocks kind of mined in this particular way. So there was a scarcity, and they were marked because one stone like this represented quite a lot of value. So like a village could own like a one coin, right? So if you think about it as a coin, you could say, okay, that the coin represented a certain amount of value, and then it was not just one person ownership, it was spread. So they were marking on this stone like who owns how much of that coin, right? And they were kind of not easily movable, so they were usually stuck in a certain place, and they weighted like, you know, 4 tons. And it was really difficult because on that island, they didn't have the capacity to kind of produce them. It was a big effort to carry a rock from a nearby island and kind of grind it to that shape and so on. So it takes like multiple tens of years. And then the new coin was minted. And that took like, 2 generations maybe. So it's a kind of an interesting, very impractical coin that cannot be carried around, but it was used as a means of representing value in that particular society. So we had this transition from barter to gold and metals, and then eventually to gold. And then we went to this representational money later. And like Greystone is just an example, some shells, piece of paper with printed number on it. It's all the same, right? So there are 3 main functions that money plays. The first function is that it is a medium of exchange. It facilitates an exchange of some value between 2 people or 2 institutions or between 2 participants. So with barter, there are certain inefficiencies. Like if I have a cow and I need bread, I need to find a baker who needs a cow, right? Because otherwise I cannot get bread. So this is called double coincidence of wants. And this represents a problem because if I have something and I need something else, but whoever is producing that something else doesn't need what I have, we cannot exchange, right? So we have to have something in the middle which allows us to exchange what we have in such a way that we eventually get what we want. So medium of exchange. The second one is a unit of account, which means if I made some promises to you, then we can record how much did I promise to you, right? So, and also what you did to me, we can record like how much I owe you, right? So if I fixed your car, okay, what does it mean? And what does it mean for me to kind of repay it? So a unit of account is like a means for recording how much somebody owns somebody else, right? And then there is a long-term store of value, which means if I worked and I accumulated value today, I want to carry it to winter and then I want to use it, right? I don't want to use the value today. I want to use the value in the later, in the future, right? So a lot of cryptocurrency speculations and kind of hype is about that third element, right? It's about the store of value, like that it will be worth more next year than it is worth today, right? So people are kind of investing because they believe that whatever they invested in will be worth more later. And money has this property of a store of value. So how reliable are the normal currencies and as a store of value? They are kind of predictable. They are not very reliable, but they are kind of predictable, right? So if I have 1,000 Norwegian krona today, I can predict, taking inflation into account and the price fluctuations and everything, how much I will be able to buy next year, right? Will I be able to buy next year as much for 1,000 krona as I'm kind of able today? No, I will lose some value, right? So there is no perfect store of value. And the perfect store of value is sort of the, the holy grail of the systems, such that we can sort of we would like to have a perfect store of value, because then we have a guarantee that the value which we hold today will work like next year. But there is no system like that. It's all a little bit like either unpredictable, so you have risk, or you have low risk, but you kind of are paying kind of price for the low risk, right? So Norwegian krona is a relatively low risk. Like it's not likely that next year Norway gonna go bankrupt and we gonna have like hyperinflation. So it's okay, like the risk is low, but there is a built-in inflation. Like I'm gonna buy less next year for 1,000 krona than today, right? So those 3 functions are not necessarily kind of the same, like they are different. Those 3 functions are different. So something that is really good as a medium of exchange may not be necessarily a good store of value. And something that is a good store of value may not necessarily be a good medium of exchange, right? So if you take gold, for example, gold trajectory over multiple millennia has been quite steadily reflecting the value, right? So whatever you could buy for 10 grams of gold 10 years ago is what you can buy for 10 grams of gold today, right? So as a store of value, gold tends to be quite a good store of value. But gold is like terrible medium of exchange, like how you gonna pay for things with gold, right? We tried it, yeah, but it's not that great, right? So like currencies which are dividable, which are kind of which has this representational value, are a much better medium of exchange than store of value. And then a unit of account is kind of simple. Like this function is actually quite easy to achieve with different means, right? One interesting medium of exchange experiment was in the Middle Ages. We had the traders which were going to India and then coming back to Europe, and they all going somewhere like in the Middle East. And we had markets, right? So what is a market? A market is when buyers and sellers meet and they exchange. They exchange whatever sellers want to sell and whatever buyers want to buy. So a market is a kind of a place where exchange happens, right? And it was very interesting before we had this sort of a modern markets, that there existed markets where to join the market, you're gonna, let's say, it's a little bit like in a casino, right? So when you're going to casino, you're taking your fiat money and you're buying tokens. You're buying those kind of virtual tokens. And then you play in the casino. And then at the end, you go back and you say, I want to change my tokens back to fiat money, right? So it was the same there. You go to a market and you say, I have a cow, right? So the organizers of the market would say, okay, your cow is worth 10 tokens. Here is 10 tokens. And at the end of the day, you either give us back the 10 tokens, which we just give you, or you have to give us a cow, right? So then you take those 10 tokens, and then you have a cow and 10 tokens. And then you're sort of doing transactions. So you go to somebody and you say, oh, I want your bread. So here are like 2 tokens for the bread. I want potatoes. There are tokens for potatoes, and you're trading. You're trading those tokens in the market. And at the end of the day, you have like, maybe you sold your cow, maybe you didn't. Or if you sold your cow, that's great. But you have some potatoes, you have some apples, and you have some leftover tokens. And then if you sold your cow, you have to have more than 10 because you have to pay 10 to the organizers, right? Otherwise, they're gonna take your cow or gonna take your whatever you have to recover the 10 tokens they gave you. And those 10 tokens only work during the day, right? So it's sort of like money, but the time life of this money of the market is only worth the day. And at the end of the day, the tokens you have are worth nothing, right? So it's sort of, you go to the market, you get certain tokens for the value you have, you exchange your value you have with others, and at the end of the day, the balance should be kind of zero. Like you should have no tokens left, and you should have exchanged the value you had for something others had, right? You understand the concept? And the interesting property is that the money are kind of generated on the fly for 8 hours, and then they kind of disappear. That's it, right? So those money on this market as a store of value are terrible. Like they don't store any value over the duration of a day, right? They only store value for that one day, and that's it. But as a medium of exchange, they are pretty good. Like it's sort of a very convenient way for people to have a market and exchange goods, right? So then we have modern times, and with modern times we used paper and like minting of coins, and we went for electronic currencies. So there was a lot of electronic currencies before cryptocurrencies, and they were kind of, some of them were only exchanged electronically, and they have some sort of linkage to the banking system. Electronic fund transfer, banks, like, systems sort of similar to VIPs, okay? So those are kind of electronic currencies, right? And then you also had, before cryptocurrencies happened, you also had kind of a virtual currencies. So you had some reward tokens, or you had some game tokens, or you had something that is not a real currency, but it represents a certain value, right? So if you are participating in some shops chain and they give you rewards or reward points, and then you can convert it, you can say, I want to buy something for those reward points. It represents kind of a value, right? So those were called virtual currencies. And initially, when the cryptocurrencies happen, the language was to call those tokens also virtual currencies, because cryptocurrencies were very similar to what we had before, right? But there is a small difference, like the virtual currencies and cryptocurrencies. Now we understand that they are a little bit differently regulated and they are a little bit different, right? A lot of virtual currencies were not supposed to be used as means of exchange. So regulators didn't want the virtual currencies to be actually treated like currencies. So game dollars and so on, there were some tensions of people or users exchanging like virtual currencies, game dollars, for real dollars, or buying something for real. And normally in the terms of service, that is sort of forbidden. Otherwise, there are certain regulations which the game company or somebody has to follow. So it's a little bit a complicated landscape, but in general, virtual currencies are kind of regulated differently than the cryptocurrencies. So then there was digital gold. So as we discussed, gold is a little bit not nice as means of exchange. So very quickly we came up with the idea, let's say, no, let's put the 1 kilogram of gold somewhere in the safe, and let's sort of pretend that those units represent like certain parts of that kg of gold, and let's use those numbers to kind of do the trading. So it's a representative money, and it is sort of like follow the backing of the gold standard. It's kind of important to mention the US. So US for many years was one of the currencies which was backed by gold. So you could go to a bank and say, I have whatever number of US dollars I have, and I want to exchange it for gold. And until like, I don't remember when, 60s or 70s, that was actually called a gold standard. And that meant you can exchange your paper money for actual gold. But like something happened. The Vietnam War happened, and certain activities of US happened, and like certain economical activities happened. So US central bank said, we kind of printed more money than we have gold. So like if people really want to get the gold, like it's like it doesn't work anymore. Like we actually have more paper than we have the gold stored. So we have to unbundle it. And if we unbundle it, we can print more money. So we can control the kind of printing or minting of currency a little bit better, because we are not tied to storing the gold and we don't have enough gold, right? So then it's sort of the world went wild, okay? What used to be a very stable kind of economical system kind of unbundled, and we are sort of observing the repercussions of this unbundling until today. So we have a certain mechanisms to control the economies, but the kind of the buffer, this sort of a slowing down of the control has been broken. So the link to gold is broken, and now countries sort of print money as they wish, right? What will happen if the country prints too much money? So what will happen if Norway central bank suddenly says, okay, let's print more money, more Norwegian krona, and let's buy US dollars for those money, so we will be richer? What will happen? Exactly. The ratio between Norwegian krona and US dollar will kind of go down, and then the Norwegian krona will lose the value. And also it will lose trust. So like people, like the other kind of participants in the system will say, yeah, like it's not a trustworthy currency. Like we have to value it even less than it's worth today because we don't trust it, right? You remember this kind of looking into the future kind of economical kind of perspective, and valuing things what they will be worth later. So if suddenly Norwegian government starts printing money and everybody else loses trust, then like the currency may collapse, like it may start losing kind of like nobody wants to use it, right? So if we go to US and say, can you sell us, can you exchange to us some US dollars for Norwegian krona? They may say no, well, or they will set the price so high that it's like really bad for us, right? So we cannot do it. But what if, let's say, European Union prints a little bit more money than usual, they should? What will happen then? It's like a very gradual process. So they kind of print a little bit too much. So what will happen? Exactly. It still happens. It like drops a little bit and we call it inflation, right? So if they print too much, then they will have an inflation. But the effects are a little bit, it's a little bit like game theoretic, right? So imagine that you have certain big stakeholders and Europe prints a little bit more money, but they didn't tell anybody, right? So what will happen? So after some time, the effects will be observed. So you will observe that like the value is actually not worth what it is, and there will be should be a correction. It should be a small drop, right? So what US should do? So if Europe prints a little bit more too much money, there is a small period where Europe has a bit of an advantage, and then there is a correction, right? But during that period, it's a little bit disadvantageous to US, right? So if they do nothing and wait, they are a little bit disadvantaged for a little bit of time, right? So if Europe prints a little bit of money and they get a sniff, like they get a signal that Europe prints a little bit of money, they should print a little bit of money as well, right? So it is sort of a little bit connected like a system where all those effects are a little bit complex and we cannot predict everything, but everybody is sort of playing for their own advantage and they cannot allow like one player to kind of gain the advantage. So it is sort of a connected system. And usually when we know US is printing money, like it's obvious US is printing money, Europe kind of prints money as well, just like to buffer the effects, right? The negative effects. And then everybody has the inflation and then we have like a crisis. Like we say, there is a recession, right? There is something kind of broken in the system, right? So this kind of US gold certificate, that was actually a mechanism for stabilizing this and for making sure that things kind of don't go out of whack. And because of this gold standard, US currency was treated as a sort of a reference currency. So for many years, US currency built this reputation for being a reference currency because it was baked into gold and it was the most stable one. So all the other countries and all the other currencies were observing what is our rate to US dollar because we want it to be as stable as possible such that we kind of stabilize the system, right? Once they broke it, and now we have this kind of very unstable system, there is no kind of like balancing, like it is a little bit like wild, right? So it became kind of a complicated, much more complicated than before. So this gold currency was like non-reversible, very similar to kind of the kind of cryptocurrencies which are backed by gold currently. And we had this digital gold standard was a little bit like cash. It was designed to be means of exchange, right? With the nice property of being backed by gold, so having kind of a stability of the store of value, right? So the idea for this digital gold currency was to have easy exchange, same as with paper money, like cash, but have the kind of a stability of going baked in. All right, so there is a concept of soft and hard electronic currencies. Soft currencies are everything that we have currently, like PayPal, Visa, and so on, where you can say when you can reverse the transaction, right? And non-reversible transactions, same like the digital gold was non-reversible, means once the payment happens, there is no way to kind of unroll it, right? So once you give somebody like a suitcase full of cash, that's it. You pay them and they took the cash and that's it, right? So hard currency means Once the transaction happens, you cannot revert it. I had a nice situation. I rented a car in Italy, and I went there, and they had like a misleading information of how to get to the rental company. So I was 15 minutes late. So when I was late, they said, "Yeah, you were late, so you have to pay like again." So your previous like rent like expired, and you have to pay extra like rent. So I paid 200 euros initially, and now they said, now you have to pay extra 200 euros to rent the car. And I said, okay. So I paid the 200 euros again, my like second time. I got the car, and then I contacted like a bank in Norway saying, look, they gave me those wrong instructions. Because of those wrong instructions, I was late, and I paid twice for renting a car. So they said, yeah, you're kind of right. So they contacted like the rental company. They didn't respond. So they reverted the transaction back. So my initial 200 euros payment was canceled by my bank like 2 weeks later, and the company never got that money, right? And it's like soft system, right? So you can kind of unroll something that has happened, right? So most of the systems that we currently have are soft because they have ability to fix something that is broken, right? But it also means something that has happened can be unrolled. And sometimes you don't want this. Like sometimes you want to have an assurance that if something happened, it cannot be unrolled, right? So the hard systems are basically non-reversible, and they clear instantly, and there is no dispute handling. Like once it's processed, it's processed. So most cryptocurrencies are like this. Most cryptocurrencies are non-reversible, instantaneous, and like they are not reversible. Apart from the exceptions of the forks that we talked like yesterday about. So electronic currencies, you have, we rely with all electronic currencies, not cryptocurrencies, like all our electronic currencies, we rely on telecommunication network, right? So what happened in Spain when they had this big, what was it? Electricity grid problem, right? So somewhere in the southern France, they had some miscalculation of how much power will be generated. So too much power was flowing to Spain, and then the electrical grid couldn't handle it. So they had to shut down a lot of things. So eventually, like there was a kind of a major shutdown of electrical grid in Spain, right? So then what happened? Like nothing worked. You couldn't pay anybody and you couldn't do anything because there was no electricity, right? So what happened if you had cash? And you go to a shop and you want to buy something and you say, yeah, I have cash. What happened most of the time? Unfortunately, they even with cash, you couldn't buy anything because the shops couldn't put that transaction into the system because the system also relies on electricity. So they said, like, we can't really sell you anything because we have to log this transaction that it happened, but we cannot. So, by law, like we can't really sell you stuff, right? So it was not only about currency, it was also about this ledger. Like the ledger was broken, right? So it is kind of a major problem, right? And then we sort of had some computer scientists working on those electronic systems and kind of making sure that things work. And they were kind of using blind signatures. So those are basically making the transaction kind of anonymous. And the inventions were sort of done in 83 and 1990s. So it is sort of like 17 to 10 years before cryptocurrencies happen. But there were kind of a technological development which were leading to the kind of emergence of cryptocurrencies, right? And we knew about them before. So like Bitcoin happened, and to many people, the happening of Bitcoin was like actually not surprising. It was sort of like a lot of technologies which were leading to it, and eventually someone kind of put it together. But there was no really any new invention, actually. It was sort of, we knew all the building blocks, but nobody kind of put it together before Bitcoin, right? So then we have the tension between centralized systems and decentralized systems. So all modern fiat currency systems are centralized. And if we look back to this to this graph, for majority of our operations as societies, we were using kind of systems which are decentralized by nature, right? So when the centralization happened, in kind of Middle Ages when kings wanted to go to wars and they didn't have enough funds to fund the war. So they were issuing this sort of like a future credit kind of papers saying, look, soldiers, if you go and like fight with us and we win, obviously, you have this piece of paper which gives you like something, gives you like land or gives you stuff, right? So it's sort of like a future, but it is kind of based on this promise that you will get something after some time in the future, right? So this what happened, and the papers were centralized because one king was doing it to his soldiers, another king was doing it to his soldiers, right? But before that, all like throughout the history of humanity, we had those kind of decentralized systems where it was not controlled by a single entity, right? And there is this tension, like which one is better, like which one actually works better. And we don't know, like we are kind of living in this big giant experiment, and we went through the decentralized phases and we hit the limits of like how well they were scaling, and we couldn't kind of scale them enough. And then we turn into the centralized ones. But now we kind of go back to this one and saying, yeah, now we have technology to actually decentralize it. And we can kind of do experiments with decentralized finance again, right? Which go back to those gift and barter economies, right? So then the Nakamoto paper happened, and it was sort of a reaction to the, or let's say, critiques of the current financial system, the centralization and the control and the sort of manipulation which happens in currency, minting and management. They forced the kind of activists to come up with this currency which is decentralized. And the idea of this decentralization is sort of a living experiment, and how well it works or when it doesn't work, we can kind of observe. So it's kind of interesting to, for example, study how decisions are made in the decentralized systems and how this participation happens and how certain things kind of work well and sometimes they don't. And we have the fork, right? Because people kind of don't agree, right? Any questions about this? So I hope you sort of learned something new, and I hope it sort of puts the decentralized currencies a little bit in the broader perspective. And if we kind of limit ourselves to the recent history, yes, we sort of are biased towards central bank currencies. But then again, throughout the history and throughout this sort of experimentation with exchange, we know that decentralized currencies and, for example, currencies which are exclusively focused on means of exchange sometimes work better, right? So it's not as if I'm kind of promoting that decentralization is the answer to everything. I'm just kind of pointing out that we did decentralization for many years, for many generations in the past, and it kind of worked, but it has limitations, right? It kind of is good, limited to a certain communities, but it doesn't scale and it doesn't transfer well. The modern cryptocurrencies kind of solve some of it. They scale kind of well, and they are kind of global. But then again, we have certain problems like, reliance on telecommunication networks and so on. But again, those are not new. We kind of have them with the real fiat currencies as well. So the kind of the landscape is quite complex. And there is very interesting kind of to observe how people are experimenting with it and how we sort of work with it. So before we go to the, let me see time. So before we go to Ethereum and Solidity, so should we have a break or should we continue for 10 minutes? 10 minutes break or 10 minutes continuation? Okay, so let me show you something. So I need to find the the slides. All right, let's have a break. So by the time I find the slides, so you will have a break. Yeah, let's make a break. 10 minutes break, and I will find the slides. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Not solving the questions.
Yeah.
So we're not supposed to write a lot like theory and
No. Just focus on the answers. Yeah.
answer directly.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yes, that's right. So the report is basically just for the answers, and then the video is more for demonstration. Like, how did you come up with the answer, or how did you find it? Yeah.
Do all the tasks.
Yeah.
And then you do the video, right? Or you do the video after each task.
You do no. You do all the tasks first. Yeah, and then you do the video. So in the video, you're supposed to kind of demonstrate like how did you solve something or how did you got it. So in the report, you say, okay, I like this particular crypto is this like so. Yeah, exactly. So it's this hash for this, right? And in the video, you kind of show how it happened, like what did you use?
Show or do I say how I did it?
You sometimes you can say, sometimes you have to show. So it depends on the question. If the question is to kind of demonstrate, then you have to show it. Like you actually have to yeah, exactly. You have to call the function and show that it actually works. But sometimes it's like too hard. It's like too long. Like you've been doing something for like 20 minutes, and then you don't have to show everything. So you say, I did this before and I did this and this, and now I'm here and I'm doing this. So that's enough, right? So you don't have to show everything.
Yeah, because I was wondering, because when you ask a supposed to demonstrate, right?
Yeah.
Maybe I don't remember everything on top of my head.
Yeah.
Because you know when you do the task, you search things up, then you find out
the recording. So it's a kind of a nice mechanism. It's a very interesting kind of a phenomenon that allows people to kind of lock capital and take loans, and for people to sort of do certain things that with the normal banking systems are kind of not possible. Like it is not possible to take like a very small interest rate loan, right? So this is kind of a very very interesting. Let's see. So there is another concept which is kind of a very interesting, and it's called flash loan. So we're gonna learn about it in the next module in the kind of Ethereum section. But the idea is that you have smart contracts and you have a transaction, and the transaction is interacting with the blockchain. So you have your blockchain here, Ethereum blockchain. You're making a transaction, and that transaction can call kind of behavior of smart contracts. So you can do certain things in the blockchain. And one of the things that kind of exist in the blockchain is, for example, decentralized exchanges, DEXs. So in a DEX, you have an asset 1, and you're kind of exchanging it for asset 2. So you let's say you're going from Ether to something, to like robbed BTC or something, right? So you can sell Ether to rob BTC, or you can kind of sell rob BTC for Ether. So you have different exchanges, and you have ability to arbitrage. Maybe in one exchange, robbed Ether is worth a little bit more than in another, so you can buy it here and sell it here a little bit more expensive, and so on. So you can do arbitrage, right? So then in the transaction, you can do the arbitrage. So now a flash loan is, again, kind of a protocol which allows you to take a loan. And you can take the loan just for this one transaction, right? So, and in this one transaction, you are taking the loan and you have to repay it back in one atomic operation. So if you're not able to repay it back, that means the transaction never happened. But if that transaction happened, that means you took the money, you did something, and then you repay the loan back. So it has to happen. So my risk of giving you this loan is 0. I have 100% assurance you're gonna repay me that loan, right? There is not possible for you to take the money, do something, and don't repay me, because it's like baked into the transaction. It has to happen atomically, right? If you didn't repay, that means the transaction didn't happen. So the risk is 0. So if I have capital and my risk of lending you money for this one transaction is 0, the fee is also very small. I can kind of do it like frequently. And because I don't suffer a risk, I can kind of take a very small like interest on taking that loan, right? So flash loans are kind of very interesting concept, which allows anybody to take a relatively large loan for just one transaction, and there is no regulatory oversight, that like nobody is notified and so on. There is no risk. It's perfect for arbitrage, and then anyone can do it. Like you can be a kid, like a child somewhere with a laptop, and you can do it, right? And then what will happen if you let people do that? So imagine that suddenly you have the ability to take $20 billion for just one operation, but you have to like do something and then pay it back, right? What could you do? You could test certain loopholes. You could kind of test the system, right? You could do arbitrage on large scale of things that are kind of not working too well, right? So if food in Sweden is cheaper than in Norway, you could kind of like take a massive loan and then buy it there and sell it here, make a lot of profit, pay your loan back, and kind of keep doing that, right? And if you keep doing that, what's going to happen? Like bad things will happen to the economy, like to the monopolies and so on, right? I mean, with food, it's not such a good example because it requires like a transport and so on. There are hidden costs, there are co-founding variables. But if we talk just about electronic systems, where borders are not an issue and you can kind of do it atomically, then you have some sort of ability to test the loopholes. And that's exactly what happens. So by the way, this is like a screenshot for the liquidation auctions. So you can see which token is going to be liquidated for what price, and you can bid. Like you can say, yeah, I want to take this. I want to buy it cheaply, and then maybe I will sell it immediately and so on. So you can do arbitrage. So what you can do is you can take this flash loan and observe the liquidation auctions for those liquidations that we talked before, and you can do arbitrage, right? So it also allows you to do price manipulation, because what happens if you have suddenly $10 billion and you're buying or selling something? You manipulate the price. If you suddenly say, I want to buy, $10 billion worth of Colombian pesos, what's going to happen to the Colombian pesos? It's going to kind of go up because you like draining all the demand, right? So the price will go up. But if you suddenly sell it, the price will collapse, right? So you can kind of drive certain assets or certain currencies down to 0 and crash them, right? So it's a huge capital kind of is used for price manipulation. So you can force the price to go up and then sell something when the price is kind of up and so on, right? There is some examples. We're not gonna talk about the examples now, but there is a question. Yeah, I don't have that question now. So anyway, there was a question: how much scams are using kind of flash loans to do the scams, and it's a huge percentage. So like a lot of crashes and a lot of scams have been like driven by the ability to for the attackers to take the flash loans, right? And the kind of the idea is that it is bad because we are sort of yeah. So I kind of yeah. This is the question. So flash loans attacks are responsible for like half of all the hacks that happened in the crypto space, right? So you may say, yeah, they should be banned. They are like really bad mechanism, right? But actually, maybe it is a good thing. So maybe the ability for anybody, any kid, to kind of expose the flaws in a system makes the system better, makes the system more resilient, and makes the system actually fairer. So it is sort of like the attackers always expose holes in the system, which needs to be fixed. So the attacks with flash loans, if the flash loans don't exist, are only able, like the whales can do them, right? But now everybody can do them. It's kind of democratized, right? So we know about those big finance problems, and usually they involve some big financial institutions. So now the same problems are kind of able for anybody to kind of poke the holes and kind of investigate and like expose, and then it makes the system kind of resilient to financial manipulation and to kind of people with very deep pockets to kind of benefit from, right? But people do lose money. Like it affects real people, and it really a lot of people are losing money because of this, right? So it is sort of very interesting. It is complicated, and it is all initiated by this new blockchain, which we haven't talked about yet, which is called Ethereum. So Ethereum kind of bootstrapped the whole process, and it kind of enabled some of those innovations and some of those things to happen. Now we have like modern versions which are similar, and they offer similar capabilities. But we have to kind of start and talk about Ethereum first. So let me open the Ethereum slide deck. Yeah, so we have Bitcoin existing already for close to 4 years, and we have Bitcoin script, and we have a young student, young person, sort of seeing the potential, seeing the abilities that can happen if we allow the Bitcoin script to be a little bit more powerful, if we allow Bitcoin script to be like general purpose language. So that means we can bootstrap the decentralized applications. We can bootstrap sort of like a deployment or more complex contracts that go beyond the language that Bitcoin has. So we talked about Bitcoin script, and we talked about Bitcoin being able to express certain puzzles or certain simple systems for money transfer and so on. And we can build certain additional capabilities on top of Bitcoin, but they are mostly focused on value transfer. But with a generic language, what we can do is we can sort of do more. We can do general purpose computing, and we can go beyond just the value transfer. We can do more complicated sort of applications. So in 2015, like the first Ethereum block is mined. So it's kind of 11 years ago, and we have Ethereum. So the main idea is the same. Main idea is that we have a block and it contains transactions, that we have the accounts for storing the value, but we also have ability to create a small programs which are kind of like Bitcoin script, but they don't live in the transaction. They are created by the transaction, but they kind of live in the blockchain itself. We can do much more. We can do self-sovereign identity systems. We can do decentralized finance, crowdfunding, voting, like many different things. And this is allowed because of the expressiveness of the language. So it's basically the same as with Bitcoin, but we have some small changes. So one small change is that we migrated with Ethereum from proof of work, which was the same as in Bitcoin, to proof of stake. So now the miners don't solve the cryptographic puzzles, which is hard and they burn a lot of electricity. They solve a very trivial cryptographic puzzle, but they are staking coins, and the algorithm kind of selects who is the next validator based on the coins which are staked. And then they cannot cheat, because if they cheat, they're going to lose the stake. And the reward is always less than the stake, so the system sort of self-corrects. So there was this interesting event where we had proof of work until we were testing the proof of stake with the Beacon chain. So those two chains kind of existed concurrently, but this one was not used for actual value transfer. It was just an experimental chain. And at some point there was the merge, which sort of merged the proof of stake with what transactions and what work was done with the proof of work. And then the transition kind of migrated everything to the new system. So right now we have this sort of a modern version of the system, which is based on proof of stake. So a lot of criticism was done to blockchain systems for burning electricity unnecessarily and wasting environmental resources and so on, which is still true for some of the chains. So like Bitcoin, it is still true that it is like a massive energy hog. It kind of uses a lot of electricity for kind of nothing for solving the cryptographic puzzle. But Ethereum already kind of doesn't have that problem. Does it mean that it's like very environmentally friendly? Not necessarily. It's sort of like a cloud system. It still needs electricity and it still needs the network to operate. It's just that they don't waste sort of like the cycles for solving a cryptographic puzzle for nothing, because the system is secured not by the proof that you've burned the cycles, that you burned the electricity, but by the stake that you put into the chain, right? So the security of the system depends on the stake that is locked in the system itself, right? So if the system is like, if messing up with the system can gain you like 100, but the system is backed by 1,000, then it doesn't make sense, right? So it is kind of based on these economical properties of like how much damage or how much gain you can gain by doing something versus the cost of doing that, right? So again, we have the three kind of nodes, same as with Bitcoin. We have the archiving nodes, we have the full nodes, and we have light nodes. The difference between Bitcoin full nodes and Ethereum archiving nodes is the concept of a state. So in Bitcoin with UTXO, we have this kind of a transaction graph. So remember, those are transactions. And then I have this unspent outputs and so on. So I have this directed graph, and I have from time to time those unspent outputs, and I have to represent it. And then when the transaction happens, the unspent output becomes spent, and then I have the update I have this new to be UTXOs, but this one is spent. So this is all that I need to store, right? So if you store all of this all the way to the Genesis block, then you are called a full node. But that's it. There is no kind of archive. Like you either store everything or you don't. So it's the same with Ethereum. You have transactions, but you don't have UTXOs. So the Ethereum model is based on accounts, and you don't have kind of inputs, outputs. It's a much more linear system. So you have basically a transaction which takes something from somewhere and puts it somewhere else. You can like you have a transaction which takes something from one account and puts it to a different account, and then this account can have a transaction like taking it somewhere, right? And if this is, so this is account 1, this is account 2, there might be another transaction taking something from this account, so a transaction and putting it into another account, or maybe taking it from this account and putting it back here. So I have transactions like moving funds around from account to account. And this is kind of like it is again like a graph. But apart from this, and this is like if you store all those transactions, then you have full node. But if you store all those transactions together with the state, so what is a state? A state is every account has, so every account has a value associated with this account, plus potentially, if this account is a contract account, it has kind of a state. And the state can be anything. It is as many variables and as many kind of things that you declared for the contract. So it can be strings, it can be digits, it can be numbers, it can be Boolean, it can be arrays, it can be any kind of a structured data which represents a state, right? So you can say, I have a state which is like I have a voting contract, and the state represents an array of all the voters, and then another array representing like what they voted for, right? So it is arbitrary. So in Bitcoin, it was much simpler because everything was about value transfer, and there was no such a concept of like a state for a contract, because every contract has to execute and finish and make something happen in the chain. Here, you have this kind of value for the accounts, but you have the state also. So if you have a full node, you store all the transactions, but you only store the state like certain transactions backwards, usually 3 months. But if you are an archiving node, you're storing everything all the way to the beginning of the Genesis block, right? So, and then the light nodes are similar. So it's like specific for a particular subgraph of the graph which you are interested in. So then you only have the light node. So you only load the headers. You don't load all the transactions. You only load the transactions that you are interested in, and you cannot participate in the consensus because you don't have the ability to validate everything. You don't see the full picture, right? So here you can participate in validation, but you not necessarily vote on the block. I mean, you vote on the blocks, but you not necessarily can generate or propose blocks, right? All right, so smart contracts. So what is a smart contract? If you have a program in JavaScript, a smart program and smart contract is sort of like a class, and it represents a certain state and a certain methods of what will happen when the methods are called. So the code is transparent, it's visible to everybody. It is deterministic. It like given the inputs, it always produces the same outputs. And it like once you deploy it, it cannot be changed or stopped. So if you come up with a program for doing something and you deploy it, then you can't, like nobody can stop it. which is not entirely true, but like in general, it's true. So why it is not entirely true? So if I have my blockchain and I say, I want this program to do certain things. So this is my program, smart contract prog, and it has certain methods. So like method 1, method 2, and it has certain state. Like I have some variable 1, variable 2, and it's doing certain things. So if I call this, it increments the variable or whatever. It's up to your design. It can be about voting. It can be about like this financial, exchanges or whatever the logic is. But what I can do also, I can have a method which is saying I will destroy this contract. So there is like a destroy method, which only the owner of this contract can call and kind of wrap it up like and destroy it. So it is possible that a contract is destroyed if it has this concept of like destruction built in. But if it doesn't have it, then you cannot, like nobody can shut it down, right? Okay, so yeah, let's not talk about Chainlink. So this is like there are different like applications you can do and different things you can build with this type of technology. So for example, you can say, I want to build a contract that will I'm kind of traveling by bus, and then I will like buy a ticket through the contract, and then if the bus is late, I'm gonna be automatically refunded. So like, or like there is some sort of like penalty for somebody failing with the obligations, right? So you can kind of build things in such a way that you have like this Chainlink example where you are sort of a company told you like, if you buy our train ticket and we are delayed, you're gonna get like 30% refund. And if you are delayed by more than 2 hours, you're gonna get 50% refund, right? And this logic is like baked into the protocol such that it always behaves deterministically. There is no court, there is no like arbitrage, there is nothing kind of to do. It basically checks the arrival times of trains through some sort of oracle. And oracle is like something which connects the blockchain to the real world. So if this is a world and this is a blockchain, oracle is some kind of mechanism which converts data from the real world to data in the blockchain, and then smart contracts can use it, right? So you can probably already see some problems here. So what if I bought a ticket and then I fake that the train was lost so I can fraud the company and get refunds, right? Even though the train was not lost, right? The train was not late. So you kind of need to secure, like you need to put trust somewhere and you have to secure certain elements. So one kind of a crucial element is that this oracle is not like it cannot be manipulated, right? Because if this oracle reads data from a website and you can hack that website and manipulate the entry to this oracle, then you can kind of do certain types of attacks, right? And people are doing that, like especially for price manipulation. There is a lot of logic which depends on the real world price of something. And then if that real world price of something is taken from a source which can be like manipulated, you can kind of trick oracles thinking that the price is lower or higher than the real price. And then you can buy or sell something for a price which is not reflected in reality, right? So there is a ton of problems, but at least the idea is not about the problems. The idea is that it is possible to build logic that sort of depends on something from the real world and is autonomous. And this autonomy construct is kind of really interesting because that means nobody really controls it and nobody owns it, right? So once something is deployed and everything that is deployed has an owner, but the owner is pseudo-anonymous, right? pseudonymous. And you can burn your key. So you can kind of deploy something, be pseudo-anonymous, burn your key, and then it's sort of like it never gonna be like, even if it has the destroy method, maybe nobody can ever call this destroy method, right? So it kind of is gonna work forever, right? So one interesting thing is that there is a service which is used for exchanging, it's for obfuscating the funds. So the service allows, like I will talk, yeah, so let me talk about it afterwards. So anyway, the idea is that you can build this logic and you can deploy it and it cannot be shut down. And then you can kind of do stuff with it. We kind of diving here a little bit into the mechanisms of the consensus client and execution client. We don't have to go that deep. So this is about like how the consensus actually happens in Ethereum. And it's a little bit more complicated than in Bitcoin. So in Bitcoin, we only have the miners and the validating nodes. And the validating nodes select what is legal, what is not legal. And the miners are solving the cryptographic puzzles and broadcasting the new blocks. And the validators agree what is the longest chain and what is the longest difficulty chain, right? Here, it's a little bit more complicated because we have this proof of stake. We have this sort of like a random selection of the validators of who is allowed to propose new blocks, and then how the proposals are being kind of agreed on and validated. So it is a little bit technical, but we don't kind of need to go there. So we don't need to, I will skip this, the Ethereum consensus, because it is a little bit technical. So it is same as with the blockchain, Bitcoin blockchain. You may have two validators proposing kind of a block at the same time. So there is a little bit of a race, and this race happens kind of all the time. So it is, we go from the Genesis block, and then it can happen that we have kind of like this path to block G. But while this path exists, there is another path which had a fork. So we have kind of a fork here and two forks there. And it has to be kind of a consolidated. So there is a separate algorithm which kind of observes of what the forks are happening in Ethereum, and it kind of consolidates the transactions in such a way as to make the minimal impact on the transaction sets. And it also kind of weights, there is like a weighting process which kind of makes certain things kind of more valuable than others. So, this path is longer, it's like a longer chain, but it is weighted like less than this chain, which is like ACE. And this kind of chain will win because of the way the algorithm works. So again, we don't have to really go into all the details, but the idea is that, because of the weighting and because of this ghost algorithm, we will always select this sort of a single block, which is the winner. Like everybody has to follow the same algorithm and sort of agree that E, given the current complex situation of the two forks, one fork here and another fork here, that the E is like a single best winner, right? Right, so finality is a concept of when something cannot be changed, right? So finality is like an idea that if you baked something in, there is no way it can be possibly changed, right? And the finality in Bitcoin is probabilistic. So we discussed like the longer you wait, the less likely it is possible that your transaction in a block n blocks back in the past is gonna be changed. And we can assume that after like 1 hour, you are so close to like 99.9999% probability that you assume that the transaction is final. It's like not changed, right? But you don't have 100% of finality. It's probabilistic. Here, it's similar. There is a period of time where the probability is probabilistic. And then you have a kind of a certain yeah, so in Bitcoin, the finality is probabilistic, and in Ethereum, so as we discussed, you have like certain number of confirmations, and if your confirmations are kind of like much longer than 6, then you are kind of don't expect any other fork to kind of win anymore. So your transaction is kind of considered like solid, but it is still probabilistic. In Ethereum, it's a little bit different. So in Ethereum, you have Genesis block, and then you have a certain blocks which has been finalized. And that means they have been frozen in such a way that no possible forks exist anymore. They cannot happen. Like the protocol ensures that there is no forks from like this block anymore. They could be forks from from this block. They could be forks from other blocks, which are kind of in the non-finalization stage, and this consolidation with the Ghost and Casper algorithms are happening. But once the block is finalized, that means the transactions in that block cannot be reverted or touched, right? In normal circumstances, because if the if the community decides to fork, if they decide we want to rewrite the history, we want to go and fork from this moment, then we're gonna create a new Ethereum foundation chain. Theoretically, that is possible, but in practice, that would require substantial amount of stake to be kind of broken up, and that economical incentive is very unlikely to happen. So the ability for somebody to rewrite the past is kind of diminished by the amount of coins that are kind of baked into the protocol, right? So yeah, we don't talk about epochs. It's a little bit too detailed, but we basically say at some point a transaction, I mean a block is finalized, and from this block, we cannot expect kind of this block not to be not used. Like it is like this block will, no matter what happens, this block is included in the history. It can have forks like going forward, and we have certain blocks which are kind of already justified and then like awaiting finalization. But this block, once it's finalized, it cannot like be changed. So remember, in Bitcoin, the clock ticks every 10 minutes, roughly speaking. So here we have a certain ticks, which are roughly 6.4 minutes. So every 6.4 minutes, we have like a process which sort of finalizes the previous block and kind of excludes uncertainty. So we have certain adjustments, and the adjustments are like if you are a block proposer, there is a certain waiting list and there is a certain disposal list. So if you want to get in, you have to wait a certain amount of time, and if you want to get out and kind of reclaim your stake, there is also some grace period. So those other kind of timers are for how the updates kind of happen. And the block attestation is like really cheap, and then you can kind of if something like if you detected an anomaly, you have to kind of lodge a formal like it happens on the protocol level. So you can kind of observe the protocol, and every time you observe that some anomaly happened, you can kind of whistle blow that there was an anomaly, and then you're gonna be rewarded if it turns out to be correct, and the person or the miner who kind of did something illegally gonna lose the stake. So there is like a built-in incentive mechanism for ensuring that the system functions correctly. And then there is this slashing. So slashing means you did something illegal, or your node was not, you were in the pool of validators, but your node was not available to do validations for a certain period of time. So then your stake gets, like, you get a punishment for being out of access, like you were not able to answer queries. So like for missing attestations, you're gonna get penalties, and then making like, trying to cheat and, proposing 2 different blocks for the same slot, or for like not properly validating things, or missing the attestations, like missing the timer. So when you can participate in the Ethereum network with your validator, you have to stake certain amount of Ether, and you have to have a running node which doesn't miss attestations, because every time you miss attestations, you're gonna pay a fine for this. Again, we have this two clients. We have the execution client, and then we have the consensus logic. So they are separated. It used to be that it's a single client. Now it's like separated into two clients. So the architecture is a little bit kind of a little bit complicated, more complicated than with the with Bitcoin. So what is the Ethereum virtual machine? So Ethereum virtual machine is basically a virtual machine to run those programs. And as any other virtual machine, it is sort of it is called Ethereum virtual machine. It has a bytecode representation for the logic of the programs, and it has the kind of the engine for executing it, right? And it has a built-in properties which we were worried about with the Bitcoin script. So we, for example, discussed that what would happen if you have an infinite loop in the Bitcoin script. You kind of go to the payment, and then it goes like forever, and the payments never happen, right? So it's even worse here, because here you can have infinite loops, and you can do certain things for a long time. So to prevent people abusing the programming language and making infinite loops, you have a built-in cost mechanism which charges fee per instruction that you execute, right? So all your programs, they have a certain counter and certain cost associated with running them, and the EVM has this sort of mechanism for calculating how much executing your program actually costs. The interesting thing is that the Ethereum is not the only one using EVM. So there is a number of different blockchains which are all using EVM technology. So they adapted the EVM technology because it's open source and it's available to everybody. And they kind of operate using the same smart contracts or the same virtual machine. And what does that mean? It means if you come up with an application, if you come up with, for example, with a decentralized exchange, you can deploy it on Ethereum, but the same smart contract you can deploy on those other networks, right? And then you have similar thing or the same thing running in multiple places, right? So any questions so far? So Polygon, Arbitrum, or Avalanche, those are networks. Those are kind of like Ethereum, and they use EVM, but they are not Ethereum. They are kind of a separate networks that kind of operate independently of Ethereum. But the core technology that they use is the same as inside Ethereum, right? So then each node needs to run the EVM inside. So if you're running an Ethereum node, you have like an EVM kind of running inside of your node. And this is like a very simple contract. So it starts with contract kind of designation. And this one is like some sort of wallet. It's called simple wallet. It has the owner, which is the address of who deployed it, who actually started it. And it has the balance, which is like a state variable. Both of them are state variables. And it has the event of like transferring from to of how much. And it sort of does some logic. And then you have like a deposit function, which deposits a certain amount of value into the balance of this contract and so on. So it's sort of like a computer program, right? If you've done JavaScript, then it is sort of very similar to JavaScript. It has certain types. It has a type system, and it has like the logic which you express programmatically. So then you kind of write this contract, you compile it to bytecode, and this compiled bytecode has a bytecode and ABI. Do you know what ABI is? So okay, so if you have you've done some programming, right? So if you're doing programming, you have some source code. So the source code, let's say, is like let's do pseudocode, and let's say it produces an int. There is a function called foo, which takes an int, and then it does some logic, right? So you implement what it does. It takes int as an input and produces it as output. It's like a pseudo C notation, right? So then you take this source code and you produce some binary, like either bytecode or a binary out of this binary. So if this is my source, and here I have the binary, right? So it's a sequence of bits. And then I need to do something with it. I actually need to call this function. Like I have some sort of mechanism for calling this function. I need to know what is the signature of this function. It's really difficult to get it from here because it's already compiled. It's like already baked in. I just have a machine code or bytecode here. So I don't know what is the signature, but I would like to call it. So then I have this ABI, which stands for abstract binary interface, which says, okay, Mariusz, there is a function called foo, and foo takes integer and produces integer as an output, and you can call it, and I know how to do it because I know, like, if you want to do this call, I know how to kind of do it inside this binary, right? So it's like an interface, but on the binary level to do this call. This interface is called API, right? So you've heard this one? It's an application programming interface, which says how we're gonna program something with this source code. We have the signature, so we know how to call this function. But this guy is not kind of like doing this nice way. It's kind of like doing the binary way of how to actually call it, like using the machine code, right? So those two are the same. API and ABI are kind of for the same function, but this one is more for humans to read and call something, and this one is more for the linker and the compiler and somebody who is like on the tool level, which actually makes the call, right? So this one is sort of for the binary interface. So then we have both of these, and then if we have both of this, and you can see the ABI and the bytecode like in your Remix compiler, we're gonna use it. So you're gonna install or use a web browser with the Remix, and then you will be able to play with some contracts, right? I don't expect all of you to program smart contracts on your own. You can copy the smart contracts that are kind of in the repository for the demonstration, and you don't have to program it yourself, but you should be able to work with the Remix, like to understand like how it works, like what can you call, how you check the state, and so on. Why? Because what we do often, we, as investigators or forensic experts, we don't write the contracts ourselves, but we plug this tool, we plug Remix into the blockchain, and we say, okay, now I want to see or interact with a contract. I want to see what is the state of the contract. I want to read the variables from the contract, right? And then you have to use some tooling. And this is basically like the way we are doing it. All right, break. All right, let's do break. Ten minutes? All right. Was I recording? Yeah. Smart contracts, and with like investigating what you can do and poking them. So smart contracts have some it is, again, it is kind of quite complicated, but some things are pretty straightforward. So if you think about it, you have the blockchain, and then you have the contract. So the contract is there, it has some code, and it has some variables. So let's say it has kind of a variable 1 and variable 2, and it also has some methods, method 1, method 2. The variables are stored in the blockchain, so they are stored in the contract, but sometimes the methods take some parameters, and those parameters kind of come from you. So you can submit them, and then some methods, you can have a method 3, which takes a parameter from you, and it produces a result, and it doesn't store anything in the blockchain. Or you can have a method which doesn't take any parameters, but it returns you the state of the contract. And then if it returns you the state of the contract, you don't have to do anything with the blockchain because the state is already in the contract. So this method, which kind of you pass something in and it gives you, doesn't interact with the blockchain. So this is like the contract, and then you have the peer-to-peer network, which is the actual kind of like the system which deals with transactions, right? So you have nodes, and you kind of interrogating the contract. And now with the contract, you have this method, which you don't need this for. You have this method, which just checks the state. And then you have this method where when you put a value here, it overrides this value. So now this method changes the state of the contract. So to change the state of the contract, you have to issue a transaction. And you have to define the transaction. You have to say this transaction is for this contract. I am the kind of calling this transaction. And then this transaction will call this method, pass the parameter v. So like method 1, parameter v. And then it has some extra things, right? Like who pays whom, right? Normally, if you're calling a contract, like the value of the transaction is 0 and the recipient is the contract, right? If you put some value here, if you put like 1 coin into your transaction, then the recipient is the contract. The contract amount will kind of increase. But if you're interacting with the contract, then you're changing the variable, you just say 0. So then this needs to be broadcasted. So this transaction needs to be signed by me, and then it has to be broadcasted to the blockchain, and then it has to be included. And once it is included, you kind of know, so this is the peer-to-peer network, and then it's included in the block, and then your client, which shows you the contract, will kind of update this value from, I don't know, let's say it was 0 to V1, right? Like, let's say I set it to 5. So now 0 is gone and 5 is in because this transaction changed that to 5. So far, you kind of followed me? So interacting with contract not necessarily interacts with the blockchain, only when you're changing the state. If you're calculating something or if you're kind of observing the existing state, those methods don't create a transaction. They give you the answer immediately. because the client knows what the answer is. The client has the latest blocks and keeps a track of the state, and it can tell you. But if you want to manipulate the state, if you want to change the state, the client has to issue the transaction. The transaction has to be issued to the network. The network has to mine the new block, and then your client will be updated with the new block. So it's much more complicated machinery, right? And someone like you has to pay fees to make that transaction happen, right? So executing those methods, those which don't interact with the blockchain, is for free. This one is free. You can call methods and check things and so on, and nothing changes, so it's like free. But the one which changes the state, you have to pay the fee, right? All right. So then, okay, assembly again. So we're not gonna go to the assembly level, but the bytecode basically is like a sequence of opcodes, same as with the Bitcoin script, and they execute this like a logic which we usually want to observe as a source code. It's much more human readable, and we want to observe the source code, and we don't really want to observe or work with the bytecode. But sometimes what happens is somebody developed the source code, compiled it, deployed the bytecode into the blockchain, and you don't have a source code. All you have is the bytecode. There is no source code, right? So you have to sort of be able to decompile it and try to make sense out of the opcodes, out of the binary instructions that sort of look like assembly, right? The opcodes are a little bit different than Bitcoin script, but the idea is exactly the same, and the stack-based execution is also exactly the same. So if you learn one, it's kind of easy to learn the other one. Do you need to know this? No, like most of you will never need to go to that level. But if you really go into like the investigations and into some kind of a forensic work, you will have to go to that level. So I had two master students like in the past. It kind of happened that both of them were from Italy, exchange students. And we worked on fetching the smart contracts from Ethereum network and then decompiling them. And then for some smart contracts, you can try to find, because smart contracts have this, like once you compile it, you have, like, they originally had the source code. And most legitimate contracts, they publish what the source code is, because they want people to know what they deployed. And then the people take the source code, compile it, and see if the generated bytecode hash matches what is deployed in the blockchain, so that the people who want for you to use certain smart contract don't lie to you, right? So they use it for verification. So there are some repositories and IPFS where people publish source code for smart contracts. So then when you get the bytecode, you can look up if you know a source code for this bytecode, right? If you know, you can get it. If you don't, you have to decompile it. So then you create like the decompiled assembly, and then you can analyze what that assembly is doing. So we kind of get this, and we can analyze what it is. And we had the first student was basically analyzing some smart contract similarity, like how similar a particular smart contract is to other smart contracts, so we can group them into certain categories. And the other student was looking into decentralized organizations and looking how decentralized organizations are using smart contracts for making decisions, for voting. So we were kind of decompiling it and using it on this assembly level. But most of the time, if you kind of just doing security or you're doing some forensic work, you don't have to go to that level. You just observe the flows, but you don't really go into the details of how they do the flows. So again, as similar with the, like if you know any assembly, like Java Virtual Machine Assembly or .NET Assembly or like x86 assembly, there are certain operations, certain instructions, and they are sort of like very similar. So in EVM, you have certain basic operations. You have kind of a call operations to interact with other contracts. you have the operations to operate on the stack, you have jump operations, and then memory operations. And then you have some operations which are storage, which interact with the kind of a blockchain data, and some which are memory, which are kind of related to how the smart contract works itself, right? Again, it's like a little bit too much details. You probably don't need to know all of this. And the interesting thing is, once you know the ABI, so if you know the ABI, even though you may not have the source code, so if you have the ABI, but if you don't have the source code, you can still interact with your contract because you kind of know the structure of the contract. If you don't have ABI, then it's a little bit difficult to interrogate and investigate what the contract is doing, and then you cannot really interact with the contract. You can just get the bytecode, and then you can work with the bytecode. So we have this memory kind of classification. Again, if you're not really programming the smart contracts on the assembly level, you sort of don't care so much. But the virtual machine is composed of the program counter, the stack for the operands. So you can put something on stack and you can fetch something from the stack. How much gas is available for you to finish? Because you prepaid certain amount of processing, the compiler will tell you, like, executing your contract is going to take so much money, so much fees, and the fees are kind of expressed in gas. And then there is like the contract memory, which is like what the contract is using while it is running. So this is like a transient memory, like during the execution. This is the immutable memory from the contract itself, like you have certain constants and they cannot be changed. So those are like immutable. And then you have the persistent state, which gets recorded as those variables inside the blockchain. So this is like a general representation of how it is. Why we have this concept of gas? So as I said before, if you have the program, so you have the source code, you compile it to bytecode. So now you have the bytecode. Bytecode is basically this assembly kind of thing. So bytecode is this sequence of numbers which are derived from those mnemonics, but you kind of basically have those opcodes, right? So that's what bytecode is. And then you have the execution. So you have some sort of VM which takes the bytecode and executes it. It runs it, right? And when it's running it, it uses some instructions and uses memory and reads something from memory, loads, and so on. So when the compiler is creating this bytecode, the compiler is analyzing what this bytecode will do and how it will work, and it estimates kind of a cost in some kind of like CPU ticks units and in the memory units. So when the kind of when the operation executes, it requires a certain amount of CPU time, and when it fetches something from RAM, it uses some sort of memory. So in course of memory, and it calls of like a virtual CPU time. So time, let's say, or cycles, CPU cycles. And those units are kind of mangled together into the cost unit, and then the cost unit is represented as gas. So it's sort of like the fuel that is required to run this contract. And then the gas is basically a number of ether, but the exchange between ether and gas, the kind of exchange rate, it kind of defines the actual cost, right? So you can think of this like if we're talking about a car, we say my car burns 5 liters per 100K, right? So if I'm gonna travel to I don't know, Trondheim, I need 400 kilometers. So I need 4 times 5 liters, so I need 20 liters, right? So the gas would be like 20 liters, right? But how much money you're gonna pay, it depends on this exchange rate. And the exchange rate is kind of dynamic. It depends how many people are running, like going to Trondheim, and how much the petrol costs, right? So the cost of gas is kind of eventually expressed in ether, but at a given time, it kind of depends on the exchange rate ratio. So this exchange of how much gas can you buy from 1 ether is like an exchange rate, which kind of the person who runs the contract has to pay. So when this one says, I don't know, like 3,400 gas, right? Gas, then I'm taking this contract, I want to run it. So then when the VM kind of runs it, I have to pay. I have to pay the fee, and it uses this gas times exchange rate, and then I get ether as a result. And then I have to pay that ether as a fee to kind of deploy the contract or call the method, right? So deploying a contract costs money. Running those methods which interact with the blockchain costs money. Those methods which don't interact with the blockchain don't cost money, even though they have to be executed. But they are executed locally on your client only. They don't involve this like global computer. They kind of locally executed only. Yeah, so this one is the kind of a static bytecode level memory, which is baked into the smart contract. So it's like this one. And then you have the word state, which is like how much information you're reading from the other contracts. So every time you sort of interact with other contracts, we're talking about the word state. And also the word state is the total state of all the contracts in the blockchain. So if I have kind of addresses, they represent a certain state of those addresses. And if I have Ali's address, the word state for Ali's address is just the balance, right? For these guys, for the addresses which are not owned by a human, they represent like some variables and the balance. But for addresses which are owned by humans, they only represent balance. And those addresses are called externally owned addresses. So it's externally owned address, or capital O sometimes. So externally owned address. And those externally owned address means the address belongs to someone with private key, right? And the private key unlocks it and manipulates the balance. So it's the same as with UTXO. It's just for one address. And the other ones are called internally owned or not externally owned. And that means nobody has a private key. There is no private key to the other ones. The other ones only have a public key where private key does not exist. And they can only be manipulated through method calls, through the state that we planned for them, right? So externally owned address is controlled by the private key, and it has a certain balance, and it has some sort of nonce. And then contracts, they have balance. They have like, what do they store? And then what is the code? So they have a certain code associated with them, and they have a certain state, but there is no like private key. So it's kind of controlled by the code itself, right? So the contract addresses are same, like they are similar to the externally owned addresses, but they are not controlled by the private key. Does that make sense? All right. So then the state, as we say, is sort of like some sort of variable that you store, and eventually everything kind of goes into like numbers. But you can store strings, you can store addresses, you can store integer values, and so on. One thing that EVM does not have and modern, like all programming languages have, is it doesn't have a concept of floats. So floating point numbers don't exist in EVM. So you only have integers. Why is that? Why do you think it's that? Yeah, less memory. What else? Simpler to deal with, simpler to do calculations. One important, so you say, yeah, Mariusz, you don't have floats, but I can send somebody 0.001 Ether, right? Can I do this? Of course I can do this. And there is a floating point, right? So how is it possible that I have floating point, but we don't have floating points? Yeah. So we basically say, yeah, we don't have floats, but we can agree that, you know, let's say we have 8-digit precision. And so if we say at 8 digits, and then if I say 1, that does not mean 1, it means 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that means this 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. So 1 is basically this. So if I want to represent 1, actual 1, I have to say 1, 2 zeros, and then 6 zeros, right? So this number represents 1. This number represents this. So I only have integers, but I'm kind of pretending to have a decimal point, right? And why this one is useful? Why do we do it this way? It's called fixed point. Fixed point. Oh. Because floats, they have rounding errors. They have certain inability to express exact values, right? So like, for example, 0.1 in the float as a float is actually not represented as 0.1 because it's like 1/10, and decimals are not really compatible with binary. So they represent a bit of a nightmare. So they are basically expressed as a infinite sequence of some other number, which is very close to 0.1, but it's not actually 0.1, right? So there is like the rounding problem that happens with floats. And with financial applications, we don't want any rounding problem. We want exact numbers. And that's why we're using integers. All right, so then you have this how much it costs to fetch something and so on. As I said, you don't need to know this if you are not programming smart contracts. For the exam, you have to program one smart contract, but you're not gonna to run the actual code. Like you're gonna run the code, but you're not gonna invent the code afresh. You're gonna reuse an existing code. So yeah, to sum up, so externally owned accounts, creating an account costs nothing. You just need to generate a public-private key pair. You can initiate transaction with the externally owned account. You can transact between externally owned accounts to transfer tokens, and they are made up of cryptographic key pair. So it's exactly the same as Bitcoin, right? Contract accounts, you are creating the contract account by a transaction, which creates the contract. And it can only be created by externally owned account, like the initial part, and can only send transaction in response to another transaction. So a contract cannot initiate a new transaction, but it can do a transaction when an incoming transaction happens. So it's sort of like a chain. So if I have a contract, so this is a contract, and then I have some externally owned account, and I have another contract. So I have another contract, and then this contract cannot spontaneously make a transaction. That is not possible. But if there is a transaction calling this contract, so if there is a transaction doing something with this contract, in the context of this transaction, this contract can make this transaction and this transaction and other things, right? So, and also like, because this is a contract, now this contract is triggered by this transaction, so it can do another transaction. And you can have quite a long chain of things happening because somebody initiated it, right? But if nobody calls this contract, that contract cannot spontaneously do something. It just sits there waiting. So that's sometimes a little bit confusing because to make this contract do something, it has to have a trigger. It has to have this sort of incoming transaction. So it can only send transactions in response to receiving a transaction in the first place. And then transactions from an external account or controlled account can trigger it. So as we see with this one was triggered from a transaction. This one was triggered by Alice. So this one is like an Alice account, and she is triggering this transaction, this contract. So this transaction triggers this contract, which triggers those two transactions. But this one got it not from externally owned account. This one was from the contract, right? Externally owned account is controlled by the human. So this one can receive a transaction, but this transaction cannot trigger a behavior. So this transaction was triggered by a human, like this human kind of triggered this transaction to happen, right? But if it is a contract, another contract can trigger this contract to do some other transactions. That is possible. And then contracts accounts don't have private keys. They are controlled by the logic of the smart contract itself, right? There is a special role. There is this special owner, which kind of installed the contract, but this owner can be disregarded or it can be used for the logic. So it's up to the designer to design the logic, right? Of how to do it. Yes, so an Ethereum transaction refers to an action initiated by externally owned account and not contract. It generates kind of a word state change. And this is also a little bit confusing because I kind of told you that this externally owned account can generate a transaction, which then triggers some behaviors, triggers some other transactions. And it is... it is a little bit confusing. So a transaction is something that we broadcast to the blockchain. So a transaction is something that we have to broadcast to the blockchain, right? So this transaction is broadcasted to the blockchain because I have broadcasted it and it is being done. But this contract calls this contract, and this contract calls other things, and this contract calls this contract, and this contract calls other things. So there is a chain, and it's sort of like we don't call this action a transaction. We call it a call, and the calls happen in the context of this transaction. So then when you go to a blockchain explorer and you kind of investigating, so let's say this is your suspect contract, right? This is your suspect contract, and you're trying to see like what transactions it is actually, like what happens, like what is happening. So you're kind of looking for transactions from this contract, and you're not gonna find any. There is no transactions which are kind of related to that contract. So you say, yeah, it was inactive, like it was not doing anything, but that's not true. What happens is you have this contract triggered by something else, and you need to find those triggers. So you need to traverse back all those calls and sort of find who is actually triggering this behavior. So you need to find this. So you need to find, okay, I know this contract is calling me, and I have to find all those transactions. Those will show up in the blockchain explorer, but those here will not until you find this one. And then when you find this one, you say, okay, what was happening? Then you can traverse all this call graph. So this we call a call graph, call, like who was calling whom, and graph, because you can see that it kind of forks into like graph-like structure, right? Is it a cyclic? No, unfortunately, it's not a cyclic. It can have cycles. It can kind of call back to something that already was there. Does it have infinite loops? No, it cannot have infinite loops because that would be, infinitely costly, right? So infinite loops are not allowed, but callbacks are allowed. And then certain things can be kind of complicated. So it is a true graph. It is a directed graph because all the calls have a direction, who calls whom, but it is not a cyclic. And you kind of have more machinery to analyze what's going on, right? So then every transaction changes the word state. So every transaction which goes broadcasted and gets included in the blockchain is sort of like potentially changing the word state. And you have the word state before the transaction and the word state after the transaction, right? Can you have a transaction which like actually does completely nothing? Like I'm transferring, 0 coins to somebody and I'm not doing any behavior. So is it possible that like the word state before the transaction and after the transaction is exactly the same? What do you think? No, why not? Yeah, so like for one, whoever is broadcasting a transaction has to pay fees. So for at least their balance is gonna go down, right? So the balance of whoever is doing this transaction in this word state is higher than in this word state, right? So it is not possible to spam something in such a way that the word states are kind of the same, right? So every transaction will change the word state. And then the word state is what we store in the client, and the full nodes store 3 months of word states backwards from the current block backwards, but the archiving node stores all of them from the very beginning. Yeah. So the call, so I kind of used the wrong term. The call from contract one to externally owned account or from contract to a contract, this call cannot happen spontaneously. That call requires a trigger, and the trigger has to come from the externally owned account. And the trigger coming from externally owned account from the private public keeper kind of initiates a transaction, and this transaction is broadcasted. So in this transaction, somebody is calling a method M on this contract, right? But if you want to find, let's call this method like foo inside the contract B, and you want to say, okay, what transactions we're calling foo on contract B? You're not gonna find those transactions because there is no such a transaction. The call happened in the context of this transaction, and this transaction calls M. And then you have to look what M is doing. What M is doing is like it calls foo, but inside the transaction, there is no mention of foo. In the transaction, you only mention M. So this has to be triggered externally. Once this M is being executing, this can do a lot of things autonomously, right? And I don't need to pay, I don't need to pay anything to the contract to execute this, but I still need to pay fee to the network to do all those execution, to do those calls and to do this execution of the bytecode that represents that contract. So that I have to pay. I'm not transferring value to the contract, but I'm kind of paying for executing it. Whether that contract transfers value to externally owned account, probably, because otherwise it doesn't make sense to make this kind of a transfer. This is technically not a transaction, but it feels like a transaction. Like if this contract pays 1 coin to Alice, this is Alice, and Alice now has 1 coin more, it kind of feels like it was a transaction from this contract to this address to Alice, but it actually is not, because it has been mediated by this M, right? So that's why it's a little bit kind of confusing, because you say, who was paying Alice? I need to find all those transactions which are kind of coming to Alice. And then you say, kind of, you will not see them in the Explorer because they are hidden behind those transactions, right? So those transactions like seem to not paying anybody anything because I'm transferring 0 coins to the contract, right? So I'm transferring 0 coins, but this happens. And this is a little bit hidden, that the Alice got payments, right? So you have to dig kind of 1 layer like deeper, because you need to understand what M is doing, like what this method is doing. You get the idea? Yeah. So you have questions? Other questions for clarifications? Not so far? Okay, so we have basically a word state at time t. Then we have Bob, and Bob basically says, okay, I'm gonna create a new contract. And by creating a new contract, it sort of adds a new address to the word state. So the word state has now a new address to deal with, which is the new contract which Bob kind of introduced. And then the contract introduces the code. It introduces the contract state of this address. Is there any money in the address or 0 money? What is the state of all the variables? And then some storage. So the state of the variables is kind of here, right? And all of this costs some fee. All of this kind of costs some money for Bob to pay to kind of have this contract instantiated, right? And then that's it. So Bob paid this, the contract is created, and now the contract that exists there. Will Bob need to pay anything more than the initial deployment costs of setting this up? No. So in Ethereum, even if Bob stores something here for forever, Bob does not have any extra costs, right? There are some blockchains where we pay rent on storing stuff for permanently, right? You have to keep paying rent for keeping something in the blockchain. In Ethereum, we don't. And what does it mean is that the blockchain keeps growing because it's for free to keep things there forever, right? In some blockchains, Bob will have to top it up. Like it says, okay, I'm storing it for 1,000 blocks. And after 1,000 blocks, it's going to be garbage collected unless I paid extra rent for storing it further, right? But in Ethereum, we don't. Does Bob needs to pay anything extra apart from deploying it? Not really, but if Bob needs to use this contract, if Bob wants to use the code or call a method or do something, then you have to pay, right? And usually what Bob does, he creates some sort of service, and then whoever wants to use the service needs to pay the fees to call the methods or to do something with it. So now Bob says, okay, there is a new situation. We have this contract already deployed, and Bob wants to call this method. He wants to set X5 to the contract, right? So now Bob creates the transaction, which says set X to 5, and it is the recipient is the contract address. So this transaction recipient is the contract. The sender is Bob. And then there is an update of the state, which changes the storage. So originally, X was set to 0, and now X is set to 5. So the storage changed from 0 to 5, right? So this is the new state inside the storage. So we learned about the UTXO model, and we learned like once UTXO is spent, then there is like not much you can do, right? And the unspent UTXO is the current ownership of the funds. So you can kind of own that. You can unlock this UTXO and you can kind of spend it, right? Why we have this? Why, like, how would you interpret that we have one UTXO and then it leads to 3 other UTXOs? Like, what does that mean? How does that work? So let's analyze. Let's have a look. So we are going back from Ethereum. We're going back to blockchain, to Bitcoin. So we are back to UTXO, and we have this situation of a transaction which created a UTXO, and so it used to, let's say, 2 inputs, and then it created this UTXO. So it's a UTXO. So now, how come I have 3 UTXOs? So I have UTXO, what we call this one. This one is 0, 1, 2, 3. Yeah. So this one is called UTXO 0, and this one is UTXO 1, 2, and 3. So how I go from this to this? So can I do it? So the question is, can I do it in 2 transactions? 3 transactions? 4 transactions? Or just 1 transaction? So so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like what do you vote for? What do you think? How many transactions can we do? Or any number, arbitrary number. Okay? 1. Who else says 1? Yeah, it's 1. Because like once you use this UTXO, it's gone. Like you cannot use it second time, right? Like the money from that UTXO is gone. So it can only be 1 transaction, which uses this UTXO as an input and then has 3 or more outputs. And that's why we have those multiple UTXOs coming from a single UTXO, right? Make sense? Yeah. So the graph is correct. And this is just a single transaction. So can we have 2 UTXO going to this UTXO? Of course, we can. We draw it here. So if I have 1 UTXO here, and I have another transaction which has another UTXO, and I say, okay, I'm gonna use those 2 from this transaction and from this transaction, and I'm gonna create 1 output, right? So now I have 1 UTXO, but it has kind of 2 incoming ones. So this is this case, right? Why I'm talking about this? Because it's like super relevant when you're doing forensics and when you do analyzing of the money flow. So like who paid whom and who is linked to whom, right? This one is an interesting one. This one. What this one tells you? This case. Say it again. Yeah, so they send money to this recipient, right? So we have one recipient. How many senders do we have? We have two UTXOs, but how many people were behind it? One, right? Because whoever created that transaction has to be able to unlock this UTXO and this UTXO, right? So if I have address 1 and address 2, after this transaction, I say, look, those two addresses belong to the same person because that person used those two addresses to pay somebody, right? So they belong to the same person. They probably are in the same wallet. They are belonging to our suspect or whatever, right? So if I have, let's say I have some other address and this address paid to this address, then I know whoever was here paid that person. This is the same person, right? You understand this? So this is like a heuristic. Are you 100% guaranteed that those two belong to the same person? So you are called in front of the judge and you ask like, okay, how sure are you that those two addresses belong to the same person? Yeah, how sure? Pretty much. So it is like 100%, or the other alternative is that whoever created this transaction has access to the private key of this person and this person, right? So whoever created this transaction has to know a private key of both of those keys, the addresses, right? So you are not 100% sure, but you kind of close. And even if, so let's say we have this case. We have this case that we have Bob, and we have Bob being prosecuted or like in the court. And this is like a laundered money. So this is a payment which went before to address 2, right? And we now have Bob's wallet, and we know address 1 belongs to Bob. But in Bob's wallet, address 2 was not there, right? So like we got a wallet, we know address 1, 100% belongs to Bob, but we don't know 100% to whom address 2 belongs to because it was not in Bob's wallet. But we know whoever controls address 2 got the, I don't know, some money laundering money or some child pornography money, okay? So we say, okay, like we have this payment. This is the foundation for our prosecution. We want to convict you for some crime that like this payment indicates. And Bob defends is, yeah, but this address does not belong to me, right? So what can you do? So we still have this transaction, which means Bob created this transaction, or Bob knows who created this transaction. And if Bob knows who created this transaction, because Bob had to give them like the private key or the signature for unlocking this, right? So we can ask Bob, okay, like, so tell us to whom address 2 belongs to. You must know to whom, right? If you don't, then you are kind of colluding with somebody else, and you are like most jurisdictions will charge you like the same way, right? So if you don't want to tell, it's kind of like with the speeding cameras, right? You say, yeah, the car is yours, but I was not driving it. So you have to tell the court who was driving it at the time, right? If the photo from the camera is like unclear. So it's like you either pay the the fine or you tell us who was driving, right? So it's the same here. You either take the blame or you tell us to whom this address belongs to, because you have to know, right? I suspect in this case you would, yes. So to construct this transaction with those two inputs and this one single output, it's not possible for Bob not have awareness of address 2. Yeah. But if you were hacked and somebody was reusing address 1 private key, that would have record in like the wallet or somewhere that it leaked. Yeah, I don't know. Like if Bob says, yeah, but I kind of leaked my private key to my address and somebody used it to create it, I don't think that would sort of it would be the same as you saying like you paid for child's pornography and now you're telling the police, yeah, somebody hacked my bank account. Like it wasn't me paying. I leaked the PIN to my card, right? But leaking a PIN to your card is a felony as well. You're not supposed to do that, right? So I don't know like how it would work, but yeah. Yeah, I mean it is possible, but as I say, like it's probably one of those defenses that probably would go to hell. So this is a very strong case. The reason why it's so strong and it's close to 100% is that because there is one output, right? So what happens if you have multiple outputs? So what happens if you have 3 inputs and 3 outputs? And let's say all the inputs are 1 coin and all the outputs are 1 coin. And one of the inputs is this illegal payment for like terrorism. And then, one of the payments is Bob. And one of the payments is like, we don't know. So we don't know this one. We don't know the middle one. We know this one belongs to Bob. This one belongs to Bob. But can we now link Bob to this criminal activity? Now it's like really different because what we observe here is so-called coin join. Coin join. So coin join is a protocol which allows people to sign the output and then broadcast the signed output into the protocol, into the coin join protocol, which collects those. So whoever is in the middle did the same, and this person did the same, and then CoinJoin combines them into this and produces this, right? And it is to obfuscate who is paying whom, right? So this one coin went somewhere, but we don't know like if it went to this one, or to this one. So if this one is Bob, so we know this UTXO is Bob's, and this one is Bob's, but we don't know if the payment went to Bob. We have a reasonable doubt that the payment didn't go to Bob, but go to one of those two, right? So we have one of 3 situations, right? We don't know. Like it actually is defensible in court because Bob says no, it wasn't me, right? I didn't got that coin. Like I mixed my coins with the criminal, and that mixing coins in some jurisdictions is like illegal. But I didn't got the payment, right? So this is for mixing coins. It's like for putting coins in and getting coins out, and the coins are sort of mixed. So then whoever gets the coins, like let's say Alice got the coins here, she says, no, I got the coins from Bob. Like it wasn't from this illegal payment thing, right? So CoinJoin is like something that we kind of investigate and something that we track. And usually just by the transaction analysis, you cannot do it. You cannot say with confidence that this goes to this, or this means this, right? The 2 to 1, 2 to 1, so 2 to 1, yeah, 100%. You're gonna be, you know, those two are gonna be linked. 2 to 2, okay, that's not 100%, but depends what the second one is. Often the second one is a change, and it goes to the wallet which this entity controls, and at some point they make a mistake by using this change from the wallet with something else that we already know belongs to the wallet, and they kind of come and they do like 2 to 1, and then we say, okay, now we have the proof. So you kind of can like observe all the transactions and see what is happening, and then infer certain evidence that it is actually linked, right? So 2 to 2 or 2 to 1, kind of a tough. Many to many, kind of a coin join situation, problematic, not defensible in court. Like, I mean defensible in court. You cannot prosecute it directly on this. You can prosecute it on additional evidence, but not directly on this, right? How about one, like 2 to 2, where the second one is one of these. So the change goes, let's say, to this one. It's the same. It's like 100%, right? So, and by finding them and linking them, you create a cluster, and you create like this address cluster of like who is behind all those addresses, right? Sometimes you have 100% assurance. Sometimes because of this change, like change heuristic, especially if the change goes somewhere else. So you have the inputs and outputs, and the change goes somewhere, and it kind of you don't like, you cannot 100% link it, or then you have a certain like you have certain intelligence, but you don't have evidence, right? So you cannot like use it in court. Anyway, so now we're going back to account model, and account model is very linear, right? So in accounts, we have a slightly different situation. So like we usually have just one account for Bob and one account for Alice, right? Or one account for some sort of anonymous person. We don't know who that is. And then kind of Bob pays. So this is clear. There is no, ambiguity. And then this is clear, and this is clear. What is not clear is you have this situation. So, okay, and you have terrorists here. Okay, so we see a transaction coming from Bob. So Bob puts here 10 coins, and Alice puts here 10 coins. And then this pays a terrorist organization 10 coins, right? So now, whose 10 coins ended up here? Was it Bob's 10 coins, or was it Alice's 10 coins? Or was it 5 each? What has happened? We have no idea. We have no way of knowing, because the money are basically pooled. So we basically have a pool, and then from the pool it goes here, right? And like we say, we try to prosecute Bob for financing terrorism, but he says, no, I never transferred money to terrorists, right? I'm using this service, right? I'm using the service, and then I cannot be prosecuted for funding terrorism. I can only be prosecuted, if any, for sending money to this service, right? So what is the service? And it kind of depends on the nature of the service. Some services are managed, so you can like go after the service and try to like decompose of what the service is doing and who actually pays. Some services are hidden and they are kind of obscured, and they mixing coins and you don't actually know. And some services don't have owner. So they're autonomous and they just operate and they kind of cannot be shut down, right? So one of the services like this is Tornado Cash. Have you heard about Tornado Cash? Tornado Cash is a mixing service where if you put money in, they're gonna be mixed in such a way that you have control over the money which are mixed. So Bob, let's say Bob has 10 coins, he puts them here, and then he gets back kind of a 10 coins in a certain way. Like, yeah, let's do it this way, right? And those 10 coins, Bob controls, but they are kind of part of this service. But Bob controls those 10 coins now. And Alice puts another 10 coins, and she controls those. And now one of them makes the payment, right? So one of them, like I told you who controls what. So let's say Alice makes the payment. So those 10 coins are actually from Alice, but this service kind of obscures it in such a way that nobody knows who controls which coins, right? So from outside, all you see is that there are two blobs or many blobs, and somebody will control it. So like there are many people putting money in, and there are many people controlling the money who are in. But what the people do depends on the people, and we don't know who owns this, right? So Alice knows that she controls this and she made this payment, but from outside, you cannot tell, right? You don't know, right? And Tornado Cash, service like this is not owned by anybody, like nobody can shut it down. People can copy it and make new copies, like very easily. And it's very popular with criminals, as you can imagine. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So it has been declared by US I don't remember. Yeah, as a they listed it as a forbidden service. Like they kind of deregulated it and prohibited anybody to use it as a sort of export risk, right? Export control risk. And then the case went up the chain, and the Supreme Court said your decision about delegalizing that service is actually not lawful because you didn't have like it's kind of legality of like who owns it and who operates it and whether you prove to that service that it kind of finances terrorism and so on. You need to have a court kind of proceedings, yeah? Yeah, so there, the terminology is a little bit kind of blurred because you have certain services which are exclusively running on the blockchain, and there is nobody like behind it, and nobody can kind of shut it down. And there are services which have certain functionality on the blockchain, but certain functionality is outside through like some code or some cloud deployment and so on, or some app. And then usually you have the owner who manages that extra facilities. But both cases are called services, right? So we kind of have to identify this autonomous service, which only exclusively runs on blockchain. And I mean those cannot be shut down. The other ones can, like you can get a disease, like cease and desist kind of order, and you can sort of enforce certain shutdowns or make the cloud provider shut down certain customer, right? But this one on Ethereum, you can't because it's a smart contract, which is kind of autonomous. Anybody can call the methods and do this kind of pooling and so on, right? Can you use it for a legitimate purpose? Can you use mixing services for legitimate purposes? For example, yeah, Or if you are a whistleblower and you want to pay somebody, like, you know, you want to pay anonymously to your source, to your informant, without revealing their identity, then you would mix the coins and then pay to them, because then your payment would not be linked with you. Like if you are a journalist and you want to pay, then somebody can link this payment from this journalist to this address or something like this. And then it's a risk that it will be de-anonymized and your source gonna have consequences. But if you mix it and then pay, you're breaking the link, right? It doesn't mean your funds were illegally obtained. Your funds were legal, like you are a journalist, you just have money, right? But you don't want to be linked to the payment, right? Making anonymous payments is illegal by institutions, but it's legal by humans, right? By normal people. Yeah, you wanted to ask something? That's a very good question, and the answer is a little bit nuanced. So they both use similar technology behind, but the Tornado Cash is sort of like a new incarnation of it, and it uses a certain denominations. So it like forces people to certain denominations, and it doesn't leak any structure. It doesn't leak any information. So trying to work it out, trying to break Tornado Cash is almost impossible. Like I like nobody knows how to even start because it's so cryptographically solid. Okay. Monero, on the other hand, is a protocol where you kind of obscuring the transactions and the values by mixing yourself with like other addresses. And then there is a certain structure. So if you inject yourself, if you sort of start making payments to yourself and you sort of observe what happens in the blockchain, you can exploit that structure. So you can sort of gain certain leakage of information from Monero. So it's not as airtight as the Tornado Cash. So Tornado Cash has stronger security guarantees than Monero. In Monero, you can expose yourself if you are unlucky and you happen to be involved in some sort of so let's imagine this to explain it. So imagine this situation. I want to do something anonymously. So I have two cases, and I have bad luck. So in one case, I'm using Tornado Cash, and in another, I'm using Monero. And what I want is I'm a journalist and I want to anonymously make a payment, right? So I have big forces against me, and they flooded both of those systems with a lot of intelligence, right? So I am the only one which is not colluding. So I am the only one not colluding. Everybody else which actually participates right now in the network colludes. They are all, I don't know, like bad guys which trying to get me, right? So then I'm making this Tornado Cash payment. I paid a little pocket of money, and then we have those like everybody else is kind of colluding, and I have one of them belongs to me, but everybody else sort of like knows what is happening. But there is like some historical kind of process, right? So it doesn't tick like in a very systematic way, such that the colluding agents are sort of like swarming it, but they don't have like 100%. They have some sort of like majority. But I don't like if I'm one, then I'm screwed, right? Because they will unlock everything that they knew about, and the one left is the only one which they don't know about, so I'm screwed, right? But if there is a majority, then by majority means they know most of it, but they don't know some of it, then have no information. So it's like zero information of what is the likelihood. Let's say there are like two left. So like they know about all of those and they don't know about those two. So the chance is 50%. It's a pure chance, right? Whereas in Monero, if they kind of flooded the network and one of the transactions, which is like the legitimate, and I'm one out of two transactions, I might be actually unlucky, and they might be lucky such that they have, like, they know about all the transactions which they controlled, and the one which I did is the only one which is sort of in the anonymity set, which all of that they control. So there is another one. So in this case, we had two. So here is the same, and I may be in such a situation where this one was not picked because the process is a bit random, right? How the anonymity sets are created. So if I'm unlucky, they will have 100% chance of de-anonymizing me. It's not 50-50. They got me, right? And if I'm lucky and I was included with this one, then after this transaction, they observe what happens afterwards and what happened before. Like, was I used with this one before? And if I wasn't, then they get extra information. They have like a history forward and history backwards. So they kind of play with the odds of what is the likelihood of the process picking us like together, right? So it leaks certain structure. So it's not like a 50-50. It kind of leaks certain information, right? Yeah, it's sort of safer. Yeah, very popular with the North Koreans. They are the biggest users of Tornado Cash, laundering all the proceeds from the. But having said that, the Tornado Cash is solid, right? It kind of works like this. So you are a criminal. You have a certain, certain amount of money that you want to launder, right? So this certain amount of money has a certain volume, right? And then you're throwing that into Tornado Cash, and then what happens inside is kind of nobody knows. And then on the entry, it kind of flows in, and on the exit, like we can kind of expect a similar size flows outwards, and it's sort of like usually people make mistakes and they consolidate at some point, right? So you can kind of observe what is happening kind of afterwards later and what kind of came in on the entry. So even though you don't know what happened here, you sort of see a certain flow, right? So if like 1,000 krona comes in and 1,000 krona comes out, and this is used as a payment somewhere, then you can kind of make some guesses, some links, right? And if North Koreans are putting like, 25 million worth of US dollars at particular time, and then later on you see some sort of relocation of 25 million funds somewhere, you kind of make a very reasonable guess that it is basically the same actor, right? So by following the money, even though this is a black box, you can still kind of find something. So it is sort of difficult. You have to like either use very small denominations or small kind of boxes and do it over time and be kind of really systematic about it. But even then you will be leaking some structure, right? So it's sort of, yeah, probably it's doable, but it's probably not perfect, right? So the stuff which goes in here is perfect. So like, because one of the denominations that TC is using is 1. So if you really want to anonymize like just one coin and you used TC, then you are safe. Like it is actually pretty safe, right? Unless you made some mistakes and you kind of linked. We had cases like this, like somebody mixed something, it's a perfect mixing, we have no idea to whom it belongs, and then they make a payment and they use a change from some other transaction which was not mixed and it's included, right? It's like, okay, face palm, right? So you have, you have to like watch out what's going on and how it works and how people kind of like, it's really hard not to make mistakes because your wallet software will kind of make mistakes for you, right? They will like, and some wallets, you don't know exactly what happens, right? So you have to control it like manually, or you have to do certain things. Like, as I say, like, it is possible to really be smart, but it's really hard to be smart for an extended period of time. So it's usually just a matter of time. All right, so the accounts different nature, different beast, and the following the money is basically much easier. We don't have this UTXO thing, but it kind of so the senders and receivers are much easier to track, but like the actual funds get mixed into the pool because we have like the accounts accumulating the balance from multiple sources, right? So for services on chain, this is problematic. For services in a broader sense, it's not because they usually have to keep track of who paid here and who gets out, right? So it's sort of like depends on the nature of the service. All right, so then we have this gas, and we have some of operations that don't consume gas, but again, we don't have to talk about it. There is an interesting case. So a student who was working with me on this smart contracts, there is there is a destroy method. So you can call destroy on a smart contract, and then smart contract becomes inactive, and it does not occupy the space when the clients have to calculate the word state. Because from the moment that the contract was killed into the future, that there will be no state, right? Because the contract was killed. But killing a contract kind of like people don't do it, right? Like they don't kill the contract. So the designers of the Ethereum, they thought, okay, how about we pay somebody to kill the contract? So because keeping the contracts forever in the client is kind of, you know, problematic. So how about the idea that we pay a little bit of gas that you will gain if you kill your contract? So you kill your contract and then you get a little bit of gas. Any problem with this idea? What do you think? The network. So the network will kind of pay you from the fees and from the gas, which kind of goes into the transaction, right? So everybody else pays fees, but you, by calling kill on your contract, is gonna get some money back. You're gonna get some gas. It's a fixed amount. Fixed amount. You can, but you will lose money. So the cost of the instantiating the contract are higher than the reward for killing it. So it's not economical to create it and immediately kill it. So, but it's a good question. So my question one is, will the number of contracts go up or go down because of this change? So it's kind of it's an IRC idea. So like you know, kind of Ethereum change. So change that will happen. And after this change is implemented, will the contract total like counts of contracts in the blockchain go up or go down? What do you think? Yeah, so that's what the designers thought, right? They thought, yeah, it's like looks solid. The cost of creating the contract is actually bigger than the reward. So, you know, it should be more economical for people to not create dummy contracts. And then, you know, the number should go down because people should kill the contracts, right? So the student kind of analyzed this, and what turned out is the number of contracts actually went up. And the reason for it is, as I told you, after the change, the number went up and they had to kill that idea. So they had to revert it, like there is no payments. So it kind of is interesting because if you deploy the contract, the costs of deploying the contract are higher. So the costs are higher than the reward. But the reward, like the costs, is in Ether. Like you paid gas and you paid the Ether for setting it up. The reward is in gas. And what I told you about the exchange rate between gas and Ether, the exchange rate varies depending on the network behavior, right? So if you do this, if you create a contract and then wait for the exchange rate to be profitable for you, and then you kill it, then you have certain money locked in the blockchain, and you're basically waiting for the good kind of exchange rate to claim your costs, right? You claim the reward. Also, if you have some ether, you can create contracts when the price of, like, when this gas price is really low, and then, like, so basically you're playing on the exchange rate, right? And people start playing it. So they started creating all those services and everything to kind of play on the exchange rate of gas versus ether. And like it like the number of contracts kind of went up. So, and because, like, depends also on the utilization of the network, like sometimes you have this kind of up like trend, and people create, but it doesn't like pay off, like the turn doesn't change, right? So eventually that what happened, and there is a lot of stale contracts which people were hoping to get some money from, but it never happened, so they are still there, right? And they were spamming the blockchain. So exchange rate, we kind of measuring in way, like what is the so Bitcoin was 10 to the 8th. This one is like giga, so it's like 10 to 16th, but you have GUA, which is to the 9th. I'm always confused with the decimal places, but you can kind of work it out. And then the gas is what people pay for executing stuff, and it is sort of what the reward goes for the validators. And it is a Turing complete, so it can simulate any programming, but it will cost. So you can simulate an infinite loop, but that would have infinite payment, right? And you cannot do that. So, and if we didn't have gas, the malicious actors were kind of easily disrupt the network. They could create transactions with infinite loops, and we would be in trouble. So, yep. So there is a kind of a process of how you can predict what costs it will be to do certain things, and then this is like so like pretty accurate, such that you can predict of what to do, like how much you have to put into the transaction for the transaction to successfully finish. So then you have this, gas limit and how much was used. So this particular transaction, it says, okay, I can burn up to 220,000 gas, but it actually only burned 74. So the remaining kind of went back to so it was locked, but it was not kind of burned. So the prediction was and should always be a little bit higher than the actual usage, because otherwise the contract cannot finish computing, and then it will be canceled, and then the transaction will not happen, right? If you predicted wrong, you lose the fees. So you're gonna burn all the way to the point where you'll run out of gas, and then the transaction is still not happening, right? So you're still paying the fee for a transaction which didn't happen. So in your interest is not to make it too small, make it a little bit like pessimistic, such that the transaction will go through, right? Yeah, so the transactions are kind of pretty straightforward. It's like address of the sender, address of the receiver, how much value is being transferred. This can be zero, does not have to be actual value. What is the limit of what is this sort of like the total, which can be burned? And then you have this fees. So you, on top of that, you kind of can have additional incentive mechanism to favor you over somebody else, right? So you have kind of a priority fee, like tipping, and you have the base fee. And then you have the input data, which goes into your methods, optional, because you may not be calling methods, you may be just transferring value. And then you sign it, and there is a nonce, right? So the nonce is not a random number. It's not like in Bitcoin nonce for the blocks. It's like a sequential number. So what you can do is you can increase the fee, for example. Like you can override your previous transaction by changing the nonce and like proposing a new transaction which overrides your previous transaction. We kind of have that mechanism now in Bitcoin as well, which allows you to post a second transaction on top of your previous one when you kind of change the fee. Like you want, like your transaction has not been accepted by miners, and you say, okay, I'm gonna hike the fee higher to kind of promote it better. So it's that sequence number is for that, and here it is the same. So here we have a more detailed description of transaction 1 from the sender F0A to the sender C4F, and this is the F0A account balance, and this is the C4F balance, and then like the what is actually happening. So the transfer is from this to this, and we are transferring, 3 coins or something. So then this gets decreased by 3, this gets increased by 3 by doing that transfer. And then we have some sort of contract which is not affected by this transaction. So the contract 1 to 3 is not affected by this transaction at all. So it like the word state does not change for that contract. But the word state for the network changes because the state of those two accounts have kind of changed. And then there is another transaction which goes from F0A, but this time it goes to the contract. And this time we are trying to send 50 DAI, right? So it's not a transfer of Ether, it's a transfer of DAI, which is like a currency on top of the Ethereum, the one from MakerDAO. So 1 DAI is equivalent to $1. And now we can see that initial contract value for 1 to 3 was 250 DAI, and now we can see that this contract 1 to 3, which was controlled by the by this address. So this one sends the money. Yeah, it doesn't say here. So this transaction it's a method call on the contract 1 to 3, which transfers 50 DAI to the C4F, right? So it's a value transfer. So initially 4CF didn't have any DAI in the contract. The state of the DAI ownership is controlled by this contract, and C4F didn't have any DAI here or here. But because of this transaction, which kind of changes the state of the contract changed the ownership and said, okay, now F0A has only 200 DAI, but C4F has 50, right? It is not visible here because this transaction calls a method which makes this transfer, right? So you can have you can interact with your local full node using JSON RPC. So RPC stands for remote procedure call, and it's a simple mechanism for interrogating a node and getting kind of values and kind of running transactions. And you're gonna use it with Remix. So you'll have a local JPC client and a local blockchain, and you're gonna use RPC to kind of interrogate it. So if you have a local full node, you create a transaction which calls a contract, and then you are broadcasting it to the blockchain to have this transaction actually executed. But locally, you can kind of execute it on your client and observe the effects kind of immediately, but it's not confirmed yet, right? So yeah, so the validator node does a little bit more work. So like your local full node is for you to broadcast transactions and to observe the state. The validator needs to do more work. It kind of validates the transaction and validates what is the current mempool, what blocks are we in, and how it works, whether it connects correctly, and so on. So we don't have to go to this level. So and then like how is it represented? Again, we don't have to go to that level, but it's sort of worth to know that we have basically three data structures. And those three data structures are kind of all representing the state of the blockchain in Ethereum. And because of that, it's a little bit more space for optimizations. And the initial clients were representing those as three different trees. And the most modern clients, they say, yeah, but there was a lot of redundancy. Like, why do we need like 14 terabytes of data if we can reuse the data structures and represent those three things kind of using a single data structure? So now it is much more compact, and the modern clients are using the same specification, but they are kind of a little bit better in representing the state, right? We don't occupy as many terabytes of data for a full archiving node. We don't have to go to that limit, but knowing those three and combination is important, because if you want to pick the client, you usually want the client which kind of combines them together. Okay, we don't need to go to that level. So then what is left? Yeah, stack machine, we don't need to do this neither. We don't need to do this. This is like a walkthrough, like a step-by-step of how the gas is burned and which operations cost money. So like adding two numbers is cheaper than dividing numbers. And then storing stuff is really expensive, right? So you can kind of get the feel of how this works, but you don't have to kind of know all the details to do this. So the most important thing for your exam is that we have Ethereum so we have Ethereum improvement protocols, and we have Ethereum request for comments. So like the improvement protocols and processes which introduce like new standards and new kind of certifications. And then ERCs are the actual standards which are rolled into the blockchain, right? And one of those standards is called ERC20. So ERC20 is a standard which defines how we issue coins, how you issue coins in Ethereum, right? And it has because many people wanted to issue coins on Ethereum, and then we realized, yeah, it's a very good idea if people do it in the same way, because then clients and kind of wallets can interoperate, because you just need to interact with one specific interface to get like values out of the contracts, right? You can implement your tokens in any way you want. You don't have to follow ERC20 model, but if you do, MetaMask and other wallets will comply because they know about the ERC20 and they will kind of represent and display your tokens nicely, right? So for your exam, you basically have to look up the ERC20 source code for the Solidity contract and use it. So you don't have to write it from scratch. You should just reuse the ERC20 by filling up some of the details of how many coins there is, how the minting happens, and so on. So you have to think of designing your coin and how you want this coin to work, how many coins you want. Do you want to have control over your contract afterwards or not? Why not? Why yes? Can you mint the coins after the initial release or not? What is the name of your coin? How many decimal places you want for your coin? Blah, blah, blah. There is a lot of variables, right? Yep. Yeah, so that's the 7-to-1. So ERC20 and 7-to-1, it's the like NFT standard for doing NFTs. That's true. So both of these have standardized the way we can mint NFTs, and tools became kind of easy to use for people who are not technical. So then there was like a giant boom of NFTs, and we still living with the post-NFT boom era. And the tax office has a lot of trouble like dealing with this, because like how do you value NFTs? Like it depends. And Norwegian law again is very complicated, because if NFT represents like it depends on what it represents. If it represents art, then it's a different tax regime. If it represents stocks or like futures, it's a different. And if it is an electronic, it's even different. So then it's like a total mess, right? Because you cannot just check who owns NFTs, but you need to also know what that NFT represents, right? And then if there is like those stupid icons or something, is it like an art or it isn't? Like what is it? And nobody knows, and nobody knows how to tax stuff, right? So yeah, it's very interesting, but it is true. So both ERC20 and ERC 7-to-1 are kind of related, and they are used for this type of activities. Yeah. So ERC20 is just for tokens, for release of tokens, which are fungible. So, okay, so what fungible means? Do you know? Yeah, yeah. So if you have like Norwegian banknotes are fungible, because if I give you 100 krona banknote and I have 100 krona banknote and we swap, nothing happened. It's kind of the same, right? You can be very OCD like and say no, the sequence number on the banknotes is different, right? So they are kind of actually non-fungible, because if you keep taking notes of the sequence numbers and make big fuss about what, like, that particular sequence number is like important, then suddenly banknotes are not fungible. But normally we don't think about it, right? And coins don't have sequence numbers, right? So coins are actually fully fungible, because one coin and another coin are exactly the same. Non-fungible means that there is something unique about something, that it cannot be exchanged easily with something else because it has this uniqueness, right? So non-fungible tokens means this one token represents one thing and only that one thing, and it's unique. There is no other token which is exactly the same. It's unique. And this uniqueness makes it sort of special, right? Yeah. Yes. Yes. The fungible property relates to the thing that is either fungible or not fungible. So you can, for example, you can say the car which Prince Diana drove. I don't know. Let's make it up. It's like Audi A4. Okay, that Audi A4 is unique because it was the Prince Diana who drove it, right? All the other A4s are like, it's you treat them the same, like you don't really make big difference about it. So But you can trade either fungible or non-fungible things. You can always sell or buy things, and some of them are fungible and some of them are not fungible, right? So let's say you bought this Diana car, it will have a much higher price than any other Audi A4, right? So that's what makes it kind of non-fungible, that I cannot swap with you Audi A4 and we both will be equal. And that's what makes it infungible, right? Because the price is really different. There is something unique. So non-fungible things have something unique about them. And fungible things don't have that. So that's what like a banknote and another banknote is like the same. But if you have a banknote which belonged to like a big mafia boss and now it's worth something like more than like 1,000 krona, right? Then it's non-fungible because it's like a special, something special about it. It's about the item itself. Yes. Yes, exactly. Yes, that's right. Yeah. No, 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 no. So that thing about exchange is another thing. So sometimes we want a token which is given to you, like, you know, a Nobel Peace Prize, and you cannot give it to anybody. And you cannot like exchange it because it's yours. So we want a token which has this uniqueness to the owner and it cannot be transferred. So that's a different property, right? And that's a different ERC as well. There are tokens like that. So there are tokens which can be given or minted to a particular person or to a particular owner, and they cannot be traded, right? So like once you got a Nobel Peace Prize, you cannot sell it. I mean, you can sell the statue, but not the prize itself, right? So it's the same with tokens. So that's a different property. So some tokens are fungible. Those are the ERC20. Those are, you know, some tokens are non-fungible, so they have something special about them. They are unique. It's only one token which exists with that property, and you can sell it, you can buy it, but the token itself is unique. There is no copy of it, right? So non-fungible means there are no other copies. And then the tokens which are non-fungible and non-transferable, it's even stronger property, and it's like the third category. So it's unique to you, and you cannot transfer it. Yeah. Why such tokens exist? Well, we usually want to give them to people for participation in something or for recognition of something as a reward or for some reputation system. And then you cannot sell your reputation or transfer your reputation, right? It belongs to you. So it's unique, it's to you, and you cannot transfer it. So we have like the mechanisms, for example, for distributing like many Bitcoin or like cryptocurrency conferences. They have this like attendance token, and you have like a badge. It's sort of like a badge that you attended the conference. And you cannot sell it and you cannot transfer it. It's just for you, right? Yeah. All right. Any other questions? For no, we were in the different slide deck. For the current material. So for the exam, look up ERC20. You don't even need to copy it, because what you can do is you can say, I want to import ERC20 token from the repository, and it will kind of import the base class, and now you overwrite only the things that you want to configure, right? So there is like a mechanism for including, for like creating your own contract with the base class from ERC20, where you don't need to copy anything. You just say, my contract extends ERC20 contract, right? And you specify all the defaults of what you want to have. Working with Remix will take you a bit. So if you never worked with like IDE about programming something and compiling something, that's gonna be a steep learning curve. But if you did some programming before, then you need to get your head around Remix a little bit. Unfortunately, I kind of ran out of time, so we cannot really do demonstration today. But if you have any questions about Remix or like how things work, you can email me or send a message to Canvas, okay? And then we're gonna do this on Tuesday. So on Tuesday, we will start with Q&A and with Remix. And then I am gonna talk to you about those two other chains, Tron and Solana, because those are interesting. Those are a little bit cheaper to play with than Ethereum, and they have certain properties which make them interesting. So we're gonna talk about those two extra chains. Yep, so that's it for today. Thank you. If you will have problems with Remix,